This page of N64 Magazine, issue 36, smack bang in Christmas 1999, is dominated by that cheeky monkey, Donkey Kong, and his latest outing, Donkey Kong 64. Blimey, they called it the world's biggest review, which is probably a bit much, even for then, but DK64 was a proper sprawling collectathon, wasn't it? Bet they gave it a massive score, properstra. Looks like Jet Force Gemini is also a big feature inside. Find absolutely everything, it says, which probably means pages and pages of secrets and codes. Just what you wanted back then before the internet was really a thing. Service. And it's boasting 22 new N64 games reviewed, which seems like a lot for one issue. They've listed a few. Resident Evil 2 on the N64, which was a bit of a technical marvel getting that on the system, wasn't it? Super Smash Bros. Is there too. That was the new kid on the block for multiplayer brawls at the time. Then there's WWF WrestleMania, bound to be a bit ropey but probably fun with mates. And South Park, Chef's Louvshack, goodness knows what that was like. And if you bought it, you got a free fantastic Worms pen. It writes, it wriggles, it's free. Marketing spiel at its finest, I suppose. And for the handheld fans, Planet Game Boy Mag is inside too, always a decent little pull-out. All for £2.95, which wasn't too bad, was it? Classic N64 mag cover, full of bombast and bright colours. This page is the contents page of N64 Magazine, Christmas '99 issue. Blimey, Christmas already. Seems like yesterday we were all raving about Ocarina of Time. The editor's got a bit of a Christmas message going on about turkey and galaxy chocolates, typical festive stuff, but then he gets real and says it's November and they're stuck in the office. Apparently Mark's music choices are questionable. Sounds about right. They're promising a free Worms pen with the mag, which is always a bonus. You can never have too many pens, especially when you're at school or work and nicking them is frowned upon. Next issue is out just before Christmas on the 20th of December, so they're cutting it fine. There's a news desk bit talking about the 64DD, remember that thing? Never really took off, did it? And something about a new Bond game? Probably. The World Is Not Enough. That film wasn't half bad actually. There's a picture of a Pikachu yo-yo and Banjo in a cart. Random. Garini. Coming soon section is teasing Zelda Gaiden, which we now know as Majora's Mask, Castlevania 2, presumably Legacy of Darkness, and Nuclear Strike. Nuclear Strike, now that's a blast from the past. Those Strike games were pretty good on the Mega Drive, or Genesis if you're American. Which window? Then there's the N64 Arena, which is the reviews section basically. Looks like they've reviewed Donkey Kong 64, which was massive at the time, everyone was hyped for that. Super Smash Bros, which was just pure multiplayer madness. Resident Evil 2, scary stuff back then on the N64. WWF WrestleMania, Roadsters, Rocket Robot on Wheels, Worms Armageddon 64, Paperboy, Chef's Louvshack, that South Park game, yeah remember that one. Lego Racers, Xena, Warrior Princess, Rat Attack, NFL QB Club 2000, Hot Wheels, Army Men, Road Rash 64, Destruction Derby, Gauntlet Legends, and Gex 3, Deep Cover Gecko. Blimey, that's a lot of games. It was a bumper Christmas issue, alright, they weren't kidding. There's a Planet Game Boy section too for handheld stuff, and an import arena for Japanese and American games like Bangayo. Never played that one. All in all, looks like a pretty packed issue, good for a bit of Christmas reading I suppose if you weren't too busy playing all these games. This page is the contents page for N64 Magazine, looks like. Right there in the middle, can't miss it, Donkey Kong 64. Remember all the hype for that? Rare's awesome new adventure they're calling it, getting a massive 10-page spread apparently. Always did like to make a big fuss about their games, didn't they? Then you've got Jet Force Gemini, how to dig, fill your pockets in Jet Force Gemini, whatever that's about. Sounds a bit like they're still figuring out what the game is themselves. South Park Rally is getting a first playtest, so that must be new. And something called ISS Millennium, Konami's new ISS game. International Superstar Soccer, that'll be. Always a decent footy game on the N64 to be fair. The usual Club 64 inches reader stuff is there. Mailbox for letters. Tips Extra, Dr. Kit's Game Clinic for gaming problems, I'm the Best for showing off, and Skill Club 64 inches for the hardcore types, Directory for game reviews, and back issues and subscriptions, if you're daft enough to miss an issue. Oh, and right at the bottom, Heartwarming Christmas Tales. Join Mark by the log fire for some lovely Nintendo romances. Core, sounds a bit much doesn't it? And you can flip to page 130 for a full index of this month's contents. So there you go, that's what's inside this issue. This page of the magazine, it's all about a future look at the big new N64 games coming out. Right then, first up is South Park Rally. They're saying it's like Mario Kart meets South Park, which sounds, well it sounds like a laugh, doesn't it? Looking at the screenshots, you've got Cartman, Stan, Kyle and Kenny racing about, slapping each other. Typical South Park really. Seems like you can race in different scenarios like Halloween, Christmas, Even the Millennium New Year and 4th of July, bit random that. They've got a little info burst bit, saying it's from Acclaim, 128 meg cart size, 1 to 4 players, controller and rumble packs are a yes, expansion pack is a yes but no GB pack whatever that is, release date is down as December or January, and they're pretty hyped for it, judging by their anticipation rating. There's some funny captions too, like Saddam Hussein making his N64 debut, very strange indeed, and Jesus finding comfort in Mr. Hanky, that's just bizarre. Grandpa's turbo wheelchair, going like the clappers, and Chef being a babe magnet in his station wagon. Honestly, it's all a bit daft, but in a South Park way, so you sort of expect it. Then there's a quick mention of ISS Millennium, Konami's footy game. They say it's getting an update for the new year. ISS was always decent, so an update isn't a bad thing. And finally, they're telling you to check out the coming soon section for more new games, on page 16 of Planet 64 if you're that bothered. Overall, it's a quick peek at what's on the horizon for the N64, mostly South Park Rally by the looks of it, which could be a bit of fun, I suppose. This page is about South Park Rally on the N64. Right then, so after a bit of a dodgy start with South Park games, it seems Acclaim might actually be trying to make something half decent this time. Or at least that's what they're saying here. Apparently, instead of just ripping off Mario Kart like everyone else, they've gone for missions this time, not just racing around tracks. Sounds a bit more interesting, I suppose. They mention having to collect Halloween candy and deliver it, which does sound quite South Park, doesn't it? The lifespan bit talks about all the characters you can play as. The usual suspects like Stan, Kyle, Cartman and Kenny are there of course, but you can also get Ike, Grandpa in his wheelchair, and even Jesus driving around in a cloud bonkers stuff, as you'd expect from South Park really. They say there are 30 characters in total, including Starving Marvin, who I guess is there to be a bit tasteless, typical South Park. There are a few screenshots showing the game. One shows the start of a race, another has Cartman picking up an item, and there's one with Ike on a mission to find Pip. Looks alright for an N64 game, a bit blocky but it is what it is. They also mention multiplayer missions which could be a laugh with a few mates, and some weird football game with cows, which sounds very South Park too. They seem quite keen on it, saying it might be a proper change from all the Mario Kart clones. We'll see about that, won't we? Hopefully we'll have a review of Acclaim's Racer in the next issue, it says at the bottom. Well, I'll keep an eye out for that, I suppose. This page in N64 Magazine is having a first look at ISS Millennium, Konami's new football game which they are calling a soccer RPG. Bit of a mouthful that. Apparently they reckon it could be the best football game ever, always a bold claim, isn't it? The screenshots are showing off the in-game action, bit blocky looking back at it now, but at the time, it probably looked alright, especially if you could crank it up to highs with the expansion pack which they're making a point of mentioning. They say the game has a highs mode, and uses the expansion pack for better graphics, which was the sort of thing we were all hoping for back then, wasn't it? Apparently most of the text in the game is still in Japanese, which is not ideal if you can't read it, but I suppose that's work in progress. They are talking about replays popping up on the stadium screen, which sounds like a nice touch. There's a bit about the keepers being really confident, that could be a laugh, or just frustrating depending how good they are. And it mentions Batistuta scoring a goal. He was a good player, fair enough. The free kick system is apparently the same as the 98 game, which they say is no bad thing, so probably decent then. It sounds like they are trying to add a RPG element to a football game, which is a bit different. You start as a young hopeful, and have to improve your skills to impress scouts, and get a contract with a big team. They mention training exercises to boost your abilities, like curling the ball into the net. It sounds a bit like a more understandable version of the career mode from Perfect Striker, which was a bit impenetrable if you didn't know what you were doing. The info burst box gives you the details. Konami are making it. It's on a 128 megabit cart, which is fairly hefty for the N64. It's for 1 to 4 players, and uses the memory pack, expansion pack, and rumble pack, all the bells and whistles. No Game Boy pack support though for those that were bothered about that sort of thing. Release dates are TBA for the US, spring for us Brits, and out now in Japan. And they've given it full marks for anticipation, 5 red blobs, so they are clearly quite keen on it then. This page is a look at ISS Millennium Euro 2000. Looks like they are still calling it that, eh? Seems like they're trying to refine the game, saying it's going to be the most RPG-like version of a football game, which is a bit of a stretch, isn't it? They are banging on about adding longevity to the one-player game, which back then was always a bit thin on the ground. Apparently someone called Tim in their Perfect Striker 2 review was moaning about wanting a highs mode. Well, now they've got one, using the expansion pack. They admit it's early days and still a bit rough around the edges with framerate drops when the Sky TV swoosh happens in replays, classic late 90s gaming, but they reckon Major A are proud of the gameplay smoothness, so we'll see about that. They are saying if the hires mode is too much hassle, they might just bin it in the final version, which is fair enough. At normal resolution, they reckon it's a joy to play, and still has the same core as N64. They are teasing new moves and animations, and the stadiums are supposedly better with flags around the running tracks. Sounds like they are trying to tart it up a bit. Apparently the player skills are the same as in 98, but they've improved the goalies, which were always a bit dodgy, weren't they? Office champion Tim, whoever he is, still managed to bang in 6 goals against Martin, so take that with a pinch of salt. They are promising to show us more next month about the RPG stuff and how the hires mode is coming along. Standard magazine preview fare, really. This page is all about the 64DD finally being released. Remember that thing? We were promised it for ages, and then it finally popped up, but typical Nintendo, there was a catch. It says here it's bad news if you were hoping to import one, and they weren't wrong there. Apparently it was going to be a nightmare to get hold of outside of Japan. Instead of just popping down to Electronics Boutique or wherever, you had to sign up for this weird online service called RANNet and pay monthly fees, like some sort of early access subscription service but for hardware. They were charging about £12 a month initially, and then £7 after the first year, just to use their RANNet thing with email, internet, multiplayer and demos. Sounds a bit pricey, doesn't it? Officially. Looking at the diagram, the 64D itself is number 2, naturally, a drive with some special ROM chips in it. Then there's a capture cart, number 1, for plugging in your telly, video player, or even another console. Bit odd that, wasn't it? Number 6 is a modem, on its own cart for upgrades. Clever idea actually. Number 3 is a member disc, which is software to get you online. Makes sense. Number 4 is a 4 megabytes pack, apparently essential. And number 5 is a mouse, because apparently you needed that for Mario Artist games. Never did get around to using those much. Pity. The article mentions a few games that were bundled, or coming out for the 64DD. They mention Doshin the Giant, Paint Studio, SimCity 64, Talent Studio, and even a F-Zero X expansion kit. Remember F-Zero X? Blisteringly fast game that was. It says the F-Zero X expansion is the killer app for the 64DD. Shame if we in the West never see it, they say. And they were pretty much spot on there, weren't they? It really was a Japanese-only thing in the end, wasn't it, the 64DD? Another bit of Nintendo hardware we missed out on. Or maybe we didn't miss out on much, eh? Still, interesting to read about it all again. The next page of this N64 mag, right, shortcuts and news desk it's called at the top, kicks off with Bond is back. Seems they're doing another 007 game for the N64, The World Is Not Enough, which was the latest Bond film at the time. Apparently it's about 16 months in development, due out sometime next year. Eurocom are doing it, not Rare, which is interesting because Rare did GoldenEye, didn't they? They're hoping Eurocom can work their magic. They made Duke Nukem, 0 Hour, so they're not completely clueless. Then there's Ocarina of Fine, about Zelda. Ocarina of Time winning a load of BAFTA awards, like the video game Oscars apparently. It beat off Metal Gear Solid and Half-Life, which were both pretty big games back then. Nintendo classic, wasn't it? Warrants. Pikachu Strikes Back talks about the Pokemon film coming to the UK. Pokemon, the first movie, the one everyone was queuing up for. Japan's 4th biggest film at the time, apparently. To the Extreme is about Acclaim, those guys who did WWF games, losing the WWF license but then signing a deal with ECW, that Extreme Championship Wrestling lot. Bit more hardcore wrestling, head smashing and blood, they say. Real sweet, sarcastic Git wrote that. Ream. Lastly, there's the N64 diary, listing some dates. N64 Quiz issue 35 was out on the 29th of November. Resident Evil 2 on the 3rd of December, which was a must-have back then. Mario Party 2 on the 17th of December, good for Christmas parties. Donkey Kong 64, also on the 3rd of December, another Rare game, they were churning them out then. And Christmas trees, apparently the 11th of December, was official day to put them up. And right at the bottom, N64 issue 37, the 20th of December, the last N64 mag of the 20th century. Collector's edition, they reckon? Right. This page in N64 Magazine, right, it's showing off some of the latest Nintendo tat you could get your hands on back in '99. First off, there are these Mario and Yoshi watches. Apparently they're supposed to be a bit retro, like watches from the SNES era, but the reviewer reckons they're a bit rubbish at telling time, bit like those old Casio digitals that always went off in history class. Then there are these Diddy Kong racing figures, Banjo, Wizpig and Diddy himself in his plane. They reckon they're a bit like A-Team toys, chunky and beefy, and Wizpig's rocket even sparks apparently. Diddy's plane wobbles when you race it, which they thought was quite good. Moving on, we've got a Pokemon Yo-Yo. It's got Pikachu on it and plays the cartoon theme, which is a bit of alright, but apparently it doesn't have a clutch, so you can't keep it spinning for long. Bit of a letdown, really. Next up, a Pokemon pinball machine. This one's a bit more pricey, and uses LEDs instead of a proper ball, which they say loses the proper pinball feel. It makes Pikachu noises that sound like someone crumpling newspaper, and plays the American TV theme. Not sure why American, but there you go. Apparently it's impossible to resist, which might be a bit strong. Durid. Then we get to Pokemon rolling figures. These are chunky little Pokemon figures on wheels, and they're pushing these with a competition to win 5 of them. The question is about which Pokemon looks like a giant mound of jelly, and to enter you had to send a postcard by January 5th to their Wobbly Wonderland competition address. Lastly, there's a Pokemon rucksack, a blue satchel with some dodgy drawings of Pikachu, Poliwag and Oddish, and they're not convinced it's official merch, especially as Pikachu's got boxing gloves on for some reason. Bit of a weird mix of stuff really, some alright, some a bit naff, but typical of the kind of thing you'd see back then. This page right then takes us straight to the future of the N64, or at least what they thought was the future back then. Big headline shouting, coming soon. Very exciting stuff. The main event is definitely this Zelda Gaiden, which we all know now is Majora's Mask, but back then it was shrouded in mystery a bit. There's a little Q&A section that's quite amusing. They're talking about the story sounding a bit bonkers, which it was, wasn't it? Moon falling, masks, alternative dimensions, proper head-scratching stuff compared to your usual Zelda fare. The magazine guy seems a bit bewildered but also intrigued by the whole mask thing, saying it's a clever idea to let Nintendo do things they couldn't in Ocarina. Terrific, as he says, bit sarcastic maybe. Then you've got the main article with new shots of Link's latest stunning adventure. They're going on about how you need to put aside about 40 quid for this one, which was a lot of pocket money back then. They reckon these new screenshots prove it's going to be a corker. Apparently Miyamoto himself is keeping an eye on it, which is always reassuring. They're banging on about the graphics being even better than Ocarina, the environments being amazing, and the mask transformations letting you do all sorts of new stuff, like turning into a Goron. There's a picture of Link as a Goron in a race. Looks a bit daft really, but fun daft. Borington Nulsa. There's also mention of being able to throw enemies around and take on loads of skeletons at once, which sounds like a step up from Ocarina where you were just dueling 1 or 2 at a time. And they're keen on the first-person view coming back, saying it helps you get your bearings. Clever that. Down the side, there's an info burst bit with all the techie details. Nintendo's making it, obviously. Cart size is 256 megabits, which was massive for the time. 1-player game, naturally. Memory pack, expansion pack and rumble pack all yeses, so you needed all the add-ons to get the full whack. GB pack is a no, whatever that was about for Zelda. Coming out in summer for the US and March for Japan and the UK, typical, always a bit of a wait for us in Blighty. Anticipation rating is 5 red blobs out of 5, so they were properly hyped for it. Around the article you've got screenshots showing off bits of gameplay. Link looking like he's riding a Pona, some underground dungeon bit, and a skeleton enemy. Standard Zelda fare really, but shinier. At the top, there's a quick jump to strip with Rally Masters, Castlevania 2, X-Men, and Ear to the Ground. Just a list of other articles in the magazine, nothing to write home about really. All in all, it's a pretty standard preview page, getting everyone excited about the new Zelda, even if the story sounded a bit off the wall. Good times. This page in N64 Magazine, blimey, takes me back. It's all about Rally Masters, which I think was Test Drive Rally over in the States. Apparently it's meant to be the next big thing in N64 racing, after a bit of a dry spell. They're saying if you've got World Driver and V-Rally already, this one's going to blow them out of the water, along with Top Gear Rally 2, Ridge Racer and Rally Championship. Bit bold, aren't they? Warrington Nulsa. They're banging on about the highest graphics and how good it all looks, being made by Digital Illusions, who apparently did Motorhead for the PC. Sounds promising, I suppose. It's got 22 proper licensed cars, loads of real rally drivers, and a custom championship mode where you can tweak everything, even gear ratios and suspension. No track editor like Top Gear Rally 2, which is a shame, but they're saying there's loads of tracks anyway, helped out by the expansion pack, naturally. Plus, you can have a right laugh with 4 players. No to nook. There's a Q&A section, bit informal, in it. Someone's asking if it's as good as World Driver, and the reviewer's playing it cool, saying we'll have to wait and see. But it's looking good so far with sturdy handling and clever track design, all whilst keeping a decent frame rate of 25 frames per second. Apparently 25 FPS is what World Driver managed, so not exactly pushing boundaries there then. They're also making a big deal about the 51 tracks, which sounds like a lot, doesn't it? Apparently they're not just reskinned versions either, like some games were doing. These are proper different routes for each location, so you get a bit of variety, supposedly. No GT64 style half-mile stretches pretending to be new tracks here. Jedi. The info burst box at the bottom is giving us the details. Infogrames are publishing it. It's on a 128 megabits cart, which is a decent size. 1 to 4 players, memory pack and expansion pack are a yes, rumble pack too. No GB pack though, whatever that is. Release date is spring for us and the Americans, and TBA for Japan. 4 out of 5 red blobs for anticipation, so they're pretty keen. Looks alright, I suppose. We'll see if it lives up to the hype when it finally comes out. This page in N64 Magazine has got a preview of Castlevania 2, or should I say Castlevania. Apparently it's a bit like the first 3D Castlevania game, but maybe not a proper sequel, more of an add-on. They're saying special edition in the US. Seems like it's set 10 years before the first one. There's a Q&A section where they're asked if it's similar to the original. The magazine blokes reckon it is in some areas, like the Tower of Sorcery and the Tower of Execution, but with a bit of a graphical spruce up. They're going on about new characters, Cornell and Henry, who have different attacks and adventures the other characters won't get. So yeah, similar but different, standard sequel stuff then. The reviewer's saying it's a bit cheap, isn't it, being too similar? But then they spin it around saying it's the Castlevania 2 the developers always wanted to make, the complete package with bigger bosses, a new 4-part storyline and new locations. Still the same camera though, which was a bit of a pain in the first one, wasn't it? There are some screenshots dotted around showing off bits of gameplay. There's one of Medusa with snakes, and another with a harpy. They're saying the Tower of Sorcery is back in a slightly different form, and there are some platforming bits like in the original. It's all looking quite dark and gothic, as you'd expect. There's a little info burst box which says it's from Konami. The cart size is 128 megabit, 1 player only. Memory pack and rumble pack are yes, expansion pack and GB pack are no. When's it out? December for America, January/February for us Brits, and TBA for Japan. They've given it 4 out of 5 for anticipation, so they seem quite keen, or maybe Konami treated them to a decent lunch. This page in the mag right kicks off with a look at Hydro Thunder. Looks like another one of those water racer jobbies for the N64. They're saying it's from Midway and on a 28 meg cart, so not massive then. 1 or 2 players, memory pack and rumble pack are in, but no expansion pack or GB pack support, whatever a GB pack is supposed to be anyway. January release for both us and the Yanks apparently. The reviewer reckons it looks promising, even if the sea action isn't super realistic, a bit flat maybe, but they do say it's fast and smooth, like the arcade game. And simpler than Wave Race, more about straight racing than tricks and all that. They're banging on about shortcuts and massive jumps, and it's from the Duke Nukem 0-hour lot, so should look alright. They're asking if it's up to Wave Race standards, which is a big question, isn't it? JJ. Then there's a preview of the X-Men game. It's coming out around the same time as the film. Makes sense, I suppose. Activision are behind this one, also on a 28 meg cart. Same player options and packs as Hydro Thunder, but this one uses the expansion pack. Interesting. March release for both sides of the pond. Sounds like a beat-em-up with all the X-Men characters. Good guys and bad guys like Magneto and Mr. Sinister. They mention it's supposed to feel like Tekken control-wise, which could be alright. And something about a mutant scoring system. Sounds a bit naff. They've got some screenshots. Wolverine and Iceman squaring off, and Beast having a rumble with Gambit. Looks a bit blocky, but it's early days in it. They're wondering if it can compete with Smash Bros, which is a bit of a stretch, isn't it? Different type of game altogether. This page is all about the new Nuclear Strike 64 game. Looks like they're making a right fuss about it. Says here it's the N64 version of the Strike games, you know, Desert Strike and all that malarkey back on the Mega Drive and SNES, only this one's proper 3D. They reckon it's a big step up from the PlayStation and PC versions, which is a bit cheeky, isn't it? Apparently these developers, Pacific Power and Light, sound like a right bunch of Sparkies normally. But they've turned their hand to games and are saying it's the best Strike yet. It's all about flying around in choppers, blowing stuff up. Very cathartic if you ask me. They're banging on about 15 different vehicles, including Apache helicopters and hovercrafts. Sounds alright. And the AI is meant to be cleverer, so the computer opponents actually react to what you're doing, which is a step up from the usual dross. Shame there's no 4-player multiplayer though, that would have been a right laugh. But apparently there's loads of single-player missions, over 20 they reckon, so should keep you busy. Asbeli. There's a Q&A section, typical magazine stuff. They're bigging up the action, saying it's lightning quick and full of explosions. Well, it's a Strike game, innit? Bound to have explosions. They're also saying the graphics are really detailed and lifelike, with rivers, mountains and all that, and even the explosions are polygonal, whatever that means. Just sounds like they're trying to sound fancy. Apparently all the levels are brand new for the N64 version too, not just a straight port, which is a bit of alright I suppose. Down the side, there's an info burst bit with the facts and figures for Nuclear Strike 64. THQ are publishing it. It's a 128 megabit cartridge. Only one player though. Uses the memory park and rumble park, but not the expansion park or GB park, whatever they are. Coming out in May in the UK and US. Japan is a bit vague with TBA. They've given it 4 red blobs for anticipation, so they're pretty hyped for it. Mendel. Then there's an ear to the ground section with some rumors and news. Ubisoft are working on 4 games for Dolphin, which is the code name for the GameCube. Bit early to be talking about that now, isn't it? First one's a Batman game. Let's hope it's better than that Superman game Titus did. That was a right stinker. Second one's a Donald Duck 3D adventure. Sounds a bit kiddie, but who knows. Hype. The Time Quest, that Playmobil platformer, has been cancelled on the N64. Shame. Looked alright from the picture, like a 3D platformer. Capcom are still going on about Resident Evil 0 for Dolphin. Originally thought it was coming to the N64 later next year, but they reckon Dolphin is more likely now. Typical. Donkey Kong 64 and Perfect Dark are the big games out now and coming soon. Rare are working on a Mickey Mouse game and Banjo-Tooie, and there's rumors of Killer Instinct 3 and a new shoot-'em-up from them. And even talk of Bond and a Gran Turismo beta. Ambitious. Core, the Tomb Raider people, might extend their deal with Sony, but apparently some fancy a crack at Dolphin and a Nintendo Tomb Raider game. We shall see, as they say. Bit of everything going on then, in it. All sounds quite promising, especially Nuclear Strike 64 if you're into that sort of thing. This page from N64 Arena Mag, issue 36 it looks like. Blimey, that's a blast from the past. Right then, smack bang in the middle, you've got Donkey Kong 64 hogging all the attention, with a big picture of the cheeky monkey himself grinning away. They reckon it's a huge 10-page review, and that it's even better than Banjo-Kazooie. Bit of a bold claim that. We'll see about that, eh? Down the side, there's a table of contents for all the reviews. Let's have a butcher's. We've got Super Smash Bros., WCW Mayhem, Resident Evil 2, WWF WrestleMania, Roadsters, Rocket Robot on Wheels, Carmageddon 64, Paperboy, Chef's Love Shack. Now that sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it? Ghost Lego Racers, Xena Warrior Princess, Worms Armageddon, Rat Attack, NFL QBC 2000, Hot Wheels, Army Men, Road Rash 64, Destruction Derby, Gauntlet Legends, and right at the bottom, Gex 3 Deep Cover Gecko. Phew, quite a list. Looks like they've been busy reviewing all sorts of games, from brawlers to racers, to a bit of platforming, and even a bit of wrestling action. Down at the bottom, they're plugging Import Arena, and mentioning games being played in America and Japan. Always trying to get us to spend our hard-earned on stuff we can't get here yet. And there's a little ad for CA Games. If you're having trouble finding a game, give them a ring apparently. Remember ringing up shops? Madness. This page of the magazine is breaking down how they actually review games, like you're some kind of clueless punter who needs it all explained. It's got a section called How It Works. Cheers for that, N64 Mag. They're calling it You'd Rated and Completed. Bit dramatic in it, like they're single-handedly saving gaming. Apparently, Team 64 Inches are gaming experts and will make definitive judgments. Alright lads, calm down. There's an essential information bit, and they're using a game called Axelay 64 Inches as an example. Never heard of it, must be some import thing. It's got all the techie details. Cart size, how many players, just one for Axelay, cartridges and packs, and rumble, all that jazz. Looks like it's costing 40 quid, mind you. Games were always a rip-off back then. Worry. Then there's an if you're in a hurry section. For all of us impatient types, I suppose. It's about pluses and minuses for the good and bad bits, and a if you like this box. They've used Mickey Mouse 64 Inches as an example, saying if you liked GoldenEye, you might like Turok 2 or Quake 2. Bit of a stretch comparing Mickey Mouse to Quake, but whatever floats their boat. Mickey Mouse 64 Inches got decent scores though, 9 for visuals, 8 for sounds and mastery, and 7 for lifespan. Sounds about right for a cartoon game. How N64 scores a game explains their percentage system. 85% and above gets a Star Game badge, apparently super special. Then it goes all the way down to 019%, which is absolute wretched crud. Bit harsh, but fair enough. There were some stinkers back then. Finally, there's Team 64. This is where they introduce all the reviewers, with photos and silly captions. Tim Weaver, Will Overton, Andrea Ball, Justin Webb, Jess Bickham, Martin Kitts, Mark Green, Oliver Hurley, and Neil Pedo. All the usual suspects. Each of them has a Game of the Month pick listed under their picture. Seems like they're pushing Chef's Love Shack, Banjo, Resident Evil 2, Roadsters, Smash Bros, Worms Armageddon, Donkey Kong 64, WWF WrestleMania, and Xena. Bit of a mixed bag there. Resident Evil 2 was brilliant at the time, properly scary. Smash Bros was always good for a laugh, and Donkey Kong 64? Well, it was Donkey Kong, wasn't it? Some of the others, Chef's Lou Shack? Really? Each to their own, I suppose. Anyway, that's the reviewing page in a nutshell. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at Donkey Kong 64, the big Christmas game for the N64 back in '99. It's part of a previously in N64 section, reminding us they've been following Donkey Kong stuff for a while now, probably going back to the SNES days, when Donkey Kong Country blew our minds with those fancy graphics. There are a few screenshots, like one with Diddy Kong in Crystal Cave shooting with his pop guns, which they say is a bit violent for him. Cheeky! Another shows Lanky Kong climbing a giant mushroom, and then a fish in the water. Nothing too exciting there, just showing off the graphics I suppose, though they do joke about using a grenade in the fish tank, referencing Jet Force Gemini, another rare game at the time. And lastly, a snowy level. They say it's an ice world, and they are using old platforming ideas. A bit sarcastic there. Are they hinting at unoriginality already? The main article talks about the hype surrounding Donkey Kong 64, saying speculation started as soon as the N64 came out. They mention the Donkey Kong Country series on the SNES and how Rare must have been planning this 64-bit update for ages. They mention Twycross, where Rare was based, and how they kept quiet until a screenshot appeared online. Apparently the screenshot had a Kremling, coins, and a minecart, classic Donkey Kong stuff. They also mention Banjo-Kazooie in the same breath, another top Rare game, so they are clearly pushing the pedigree angle. The info burst bit is a summary table, saying it's from Rare/Nintendo, a massive 256 megabit cart, 1 to 4 players, uses the controller pack, cartridge save, expansion pack and rumble pack. No password save or GB pack, so no Game Boy link-up stuff here then. It was out on December 3rd in the US, UK and Japan, and cost £60 with the expansion pack. Blimey, games were getting expensive even then. And lastly, it's got a N64 Star Game Award slapped on it, so the magazine is clearly loving it before it's even properly out. They say it needs to justify its £60 price tag, and mention Nintendo being clueless about selling a version without the expansion pack. They're asking if it's all just platforming or if there's more to it. Basically, they're saying Donkey Kong 64 has a lot to live up to. Fingers crossed it was decent then, eh? This page is all about Donkey Kong 64. Blimey, that was a big game back then, wasn't it? This is from N64 Magazine. Must be Christmas '99 going by the date down at the bottom, so everyone was probably buzzing about this for Crimbo. It's talking about bananas, naturally, being the main thing you collect. Apparently there are coloured bananas now, 5 types, 1 for each Kong. Sounds a bit like they're trying to make you play as all of them, which is fair enough I suppose. You need to grab enough of these coloured bananas to open up the boss doors, which sounds like a bit of a collectathon. They even mention balloon bananas and bunches, so it sounds like they are really going to throw bananas at you in this game. Petati. Then there are golden bananas, which are the proper collectibles. Says here you get them from puzzles and minigames, just like the jigsaw bits in Banjo-Kazooie. Yeah, figures. Rare were really keen on those collectibles, weren't they? Apparently you need these golden bananas to get past Mr. B Locker to open up new bits of the DK Isles hub world. Gotta get your bananas to progress, seems to be the message. Come aim Jew. There's a bit on the side called Crowning Achievement about a secret tile with K. Rool's ugly mug on it. If you find it and press Xi, you get whisked off to a battle arena game where you fight off Kremlings. Survive that and you win a crown, which apparently helps with the final boss. Always good to have a bit of extra help for the end boss, right? Ooh, yeah, Donkey Kong 64. Big 3D platformer. Lots of bananas to collect. Seemed like the must-have game for that Christmas. This page from N64 Magazine issue 36 takes us back to Donkey Kong Island and specifically the first world, Jungle Japes from Donkey Kong 64. It's a walkthrough essentially, guiding you through the level, showing you how to grab golden bananas and unlock bits and bobs. They're calling Donkey Kong 64 the central hub of DK Isles, comparing it a bit to Mario 64 or Banjo-Kazooie in terms of how you access different worlds, which was pretty spot on at the time, wasn't it? They mention that the level's playable from the start and encourages you to explore it for bananas, especially checking the tops of trees for hidden fruit. The guide walks through various steps to get golden bananas, from climbing vines, shooting coconut switches, battling K. Rool, using barrels, and switching between Donkey and Diddy Kong to utilize their special moves like the Baboon Blast and Chimpy Charge. There's a little box out on the side slagging off the DK rap, calling it 3 minutes long and embarrassing, but then grudgingly admitting the lyrics are quite inspired, in a sarcastic way of course. They even quote the classic, "He can handstand / when he needs to / and stretch his arms out / just for you." It's true though, the DK rap was something. And then there's a mention of a banana bundle N64, in transparent green, with a banana-colored cart, expansion pack, and controller. Apparently, it was going for £110, which they reckon is a reasonable £30 discount. Good move on their part, they say, unlike the stubborn refusal to sell DK64 without the expansion pack, calling them fools at the end. Bit harsh maybe. The next page delves into Donkey Kong 64, doesn't it? Looks like we've got walkthroughs for Angry Aztec and Frantic Factory. Angry Aztec, right, bearing more than a passing resemblance to that desert level in Banjo-Kazooie, they say. First up, it's Candy Shop for musical instruments, because apparently that's what monkeys need. Then you're swinging about as Diddy Kong, playing the barrel game to free a camel, classic Nintendo logic. There's something about shooting switches above a camel-faced door, drums and guitars to open doors, seems like a right old puzzle fest. And of course, Tiny Kong is involved at some point, shooting switches on walls and slamming others on platforms. Sounds like a typical collectathon, really. Then there's Frantic Factory. Set in a toy factory, apparently eerie, which for Donkey Kong 64 probably means colourful and a bit manic. Bash blue switches, wander through production rooms, sounds like a typical level structure. Tag barrel to switch to Lanky, head up crates to see Cranky, buy an orange stand, because you always needed an orange stand, didn't you? Then back to Chunky's room, find a switch to rescue him. And apparently you can play the original Donkey Kong in this level too, by activating a donkey pad. A bit of retro gaming shoehorned in, why not? Lastly, there's a bit about Space Oddity. Cranky promises you something special for 15 banana medals. Collect bananas, get medals, get a reward from Cranky, the usual deal. They mention Jetpack, Rare's old ZX Spectrum game, calling it a Sinclair Spectrum classic. Bit of a deep dive there for a Donkey Kong 64 page, but alright, I suppose. They even reference their missing in action feature in N64 33rds, where they confidently predicted the return of Jetman. Bit of a boastful pat on the back there, weren't they? And they'll even give tips for Jetpack on page 31. Right then. A whole page of Simian strategy and retro throwbacks. Standard N64 mag fare, really. This page in N64 Magazine delves into the simian skills of Donkey Kong 64, showcasing the different abilities of the Kong family. We've got Mini Monkey for Tiny Kong, which lets her shrink down to a tiny size to get into small places, Gorilla Gon for Chunky Kong, who can turn invisible, Strong Kong for Donkey Kong's invincibility, Orange Stand for Lanky Kong's handstand move to reach higher areas, and Rocket Barrel Boost for Diddy Kong getting those rocket boosters. It's all pretty standard platforming fare with a Kong twist in it. The page also mentions Lights Alive, and talks about how Donkey Kong 64 has these fancy Turok 2 style high-res lights. They are making a big deal about the lighting effects, saying it's impressive and multicolored, and used for decoration. They mention sparkly lights, shadows, and even fish that light up underwater bits. It's a bit of fluff really, but back then on the N64, any graphical bells and whistles were worth shouting about. They even mention a maze section, where you've just got a parrot with a torch to light the way. Sounds a bit pants if you ask me, but hey, it's Donkey Kong, people lapped it up. This page in the magazine is all about Donkey Kong 64, which was a massive deal back then on the N64. Everyone was buzzing about it, especially after the Rareware magic they worked on Banjo and Kazooie. So first up, it's got Monkey Kart 64. They're saying don't go full throttle all the time in the minecart bits, or you'll miss switches and bells. Which is fair enough, those little details were part of the charm of these games, weren't they? They mentioned timing jumps to avoid Kremlings swinging their clubs, which sounds stressful in a fun way. And apparently you can pull levers to get more coins, which is always a bonus. Everyone loves a good coin haul in a platformer. The reviewer seems to be quite taken with the minecart sections, calling them a real roller coaster ride. Bit strong maybe, but I get what they mean. They were always a bit thrilling. Then there's Gibbon Guns. Apparently they weren't sure about weapons in a platform game but reckon it works well, which is a relief. The orange grenades sound like a laugh, especially homing in on bad guys. Saves you having to aim properly, doesn't it? And knocking beavers about with coconut shells, complete with a th-walk noise, sounds typically rare, a bit daft, but enjoyable. Funky's sniper add-on is mentioned too for longer range action. They're definitely selling the weapons side of things as a key part of the game. Next up, Animal Antics. Talking about transformations, Rambi the Rhino is back, doing what he does best, headbutting beavers and knocking down huts. Apparently, there are Rhinoonly doors. Then it mentions On Guard the Swordfish, returning from previous Donkey Kong games for the Gloomy Galleon level, saying he's fun to control and there's a challenge with jumping through rings. Sounds like the usual transformation gameplay we saw in Banjo-Kazooie. They did love their transformations, didn't they? Finally, there's a bit called Dead Useful about Wrinkly Kong. Poor old Wrinkly. Apparently she's passed away since the last game, but she's back as a ghost to give hints. They say she'll appear in wrinkly doors to help solve puzzles, which they reckon is good for novice players, but maybe a bit too obvious for seasoned platform fans. It's a bit of a hand-holding feature then, but probably useful if you got stuck. Overall, it's all sounding very Donkey Kong 64, lots of collectibles, transformations, and minecarts. Standard Rareware formula really, but at the time, that was exactly what everyone wanted. This page dives into the bonus games in Donkey Kong 64, right? Blimey, Donkey Kong 64, what a massive game that was, eh? Looking back, it's funny how they crammed so much into those cartridges. Anyway, this article is all about the minigames you can find, and they reckon they'll test your bonus game skills to get all the shiny golden bananas. First up, there's Mad Maze Mall. Sounds a bit aggressive, doesn't it? Apparently it's a simple maze shooter where you blast baddies and find the end, and you've got infinite peanuts for bullets, which is generous of them. Then there's Beaver Bother, which they say is trickier than it looks. You've got to bop beavers into a hole. The advice is to just hammer the A button and make barking noises, which sounds about right for the kind of daftness we put up with back then. Apparently the beavers aren't too keen on going in the hole, which, fair play to them really. Minecart Mayhem is next, and they're not kidding, it sounds hectic. It's a minecart ride where you dodge exploding barrels by switching tracks and luring barrels into your lane, then legging it. Sounds like a right panic. Millers. After that it's Fairy Route, and this one sounds a bit rubbish to be honest. You have to feed melons to hungry crocs to stop them eating fairies. The reviewer admits it's confusing and not much fun, which is pretty damning with faint praise in it. Woo! Then there's Big Bug Bash. Simple enough, you're just squashing a fly with a swatter. They reckon it's not as easy as it looks, and you've got to time your swats properly. Leave the buzzing fly too long and apparently Cranky Kong has a giggle at you. Charming. Donkey's Walrus Race is next, a water race against a seal. You can miss a few boys, up to 5, and they recommend jumping for coins. Apparently if you win, you get the seal of approval. Ha! Very good. Lastly we've got Chunky's Ghost Ride, another minecart one, this time in the haunted house. Slow and steady wins the race, collecting coins and dodging ghostly faces. Typical ghost house level trickery with doors opening last minute apparently. Then there's Lanky's Beetle Race, a beetle race in the Crystal Caves. Tricky this one, avoid crashing, and hold back a bit for speed. Sounds like a proper slippery race, bit like Mario 64's ice levels they reckon. Real pretty, ain't it? All in all, a mixed bag of minigames then, some good, some clearly not so much. Still, gotta collect 'em all, eh? This page is all about boss battles in Donkey Kong 64 and a nostalgic look at some old games. Under the bosses headline they're saying the boss fights in DK64 are top-notch, comparing them to Zelda games, and highlighting how Rare really pushed the boat out graphically. They mention a few boss encounters, like Lanky Kong battling a boss in a speedboat, Tiny Kong in a platform challenge, and the final showdown with King K. Rool, which they tease as being epic, but of course they're not going to spoil it. There are screenshots of the bosses and gameplay. It looks pretty chunky, classic N64 style. Sekiliger. Then, under old games here, they're getting all nostalgic about 20-year-old games, which is funny now, isn't it? They're talking about Jetpack and Donkey Kong Arcade. For Jetpack, they're giving tips on how to get 5,000 points for the Rareware coin, saying it's tricky but doable, mainly about shooting aliens and collecting jewels. For Donkey Kong Arcade, they're explaining how to get the N64 coin, which you have to do twice. First time is just getting through the levels, second time is harder. They mention barrels, fireballs, and ladders, the usual Donkey Kong hazards, and give a bit of advice for each stage. There are screenshots of both Jetpack and Donkey Kong, proper retro stuff. It's a bit of a retro corner to balance out the flashy new DK64, I suppose. This page of the N64 Magazine. Right then, it's all about Donkey Kong 64, isn't it? Looks like they're calling it a proper next-gen platformer, after being a bit down on platformers in general recently, mentioning things like Rayman 2 and Earthworm Jim not quite hitting the mark. They even bring up Mario 64 for comparison, saying DK64 is what the N64 was always destined for. Strong words. They're raving about the sheer scale of the game, saying it's massive, complex and beautiful to look at. They're proper impressed with the visuals, especially this desert level, going on about shimmering light and melted ice. Sounds a bit much, but it probably looked quite something back then. They also mention the warp pads, calling them a natural evolution of Banjo-Kazooie's warp cauldrons, which is fair enough I suppose, and they're keen on the exploration and experimentation, saying Rare are encouraging you to really dig into the game world. Character swapping is mentioned too, but they say it's not too tedious, which is good to know, because that could get old quickly. There are a few little snippets dotted around, like, one hit and Kremlings fall to the floor, wimps. And, you'll learn to absolutely despise these Viking chaps, about the enemies, classic N64 mag humor that is. Oh, and something a bit weird about Donkey Kong being lit by rings, sweet! Bit much lads, steady on. Overall, they seem well up for Donkey Kong 64, reckon it's gonna be a big deal and something properly impressive. We'll see, won't we? This page is a review of Donkey Kong 64, and it seems they reckon it's a bit of alright then. They're calling the multiplayer mode Go Ape, suggesting it might be a laugh with your mates, even if it's not gonna knock GoldenEye off its perch, which, let's be honest, was unlikely. They're describing a capture the coin mode which sounds a bit of alright. They're saying the single player is proper vast, and the level design is top notch, apparently rivaling Shigeru Miyamoto's work, which is high praise indeed. They're also chuffed with the controls and the real-time lighting, calling it beautiful. On the minus side, it sounds like the camera can be a bit of a pain, which is hardly surprising for a 3D platformer back then. Comparing it to Banjo-Kazooie, they reckon if you like that you'll like this, and Banjo-Kazooie was definitely a cracker. They're saying Donkey Kong's worlds and puzzles can be a bit similar to Banjo-Kazooie at times, mentioning similarities between Creepy Castle and Mad Monster Mansion, and Angry Aztec and Gobi's Valley. Fungi Forest is practically Click-Clock Wood apparently, seasons and all. But they do say Donkey Kong 64's environments are more polished. Visually, they're impressed, calling it crisp, clear and colourful, even with some slowdown and object fogging, which was just part of the course back then. Sound-wise, they like how the music changes with the environment, a bit like Banjo-Kazooie again it seems. Mastery and lifespan both get a 9 out of 9, saying it's got 40 plus hours of play, bonus games and multiplayer, so it sounds like you get your money's worth. The verdict is a massive 93%, calling it amazing, and saying Rare have bettered Banjo, which is a bold claim. They're really going for it, saying it's weeks of play wrapped up in one impressive package, giving it their N64 Star Game Award. So yeah, they seem to really rate Donkey Kong 64 back in Christmas '99. This page is a review of Mario Golf for the Game Boy Color. It seems they're giving it a solid 5 stars, calling it an essential purchase, which is high praise indeed back then. They're saying even though it's on the Game Boy, it's got just as much stuff in it as the N64 version, maybe even more when you consider all the places to explore and people to chat to, which is quite something for a handheld game, innit? They reckon it's got a fantastic RPG mode where you train up a rookie golfer, which sounds a bit different for a golf game, more like a proper little adventure. It mentions you can swap data between the Game Boy and N64 versions with the transfer pack, letting your Game Boy character play in Mario Golf 64 tournaments, which was always a cool idea, even if we didn't all rush out to do it. The screenshots show off different bits of the game, like creating your golfer, learning the ropes at the clubhouse with Sherry, leveling up your character's skills, playing on the greens, and even a golf clinic. They mention the 3D greens from the N64 version are swapped for arrows showing slopes on the Game Boy, but say it's just as easy to use as the N64's putting grid. Sounds like they think it's a proper decent conversion, and a top game for the Game Boy Color. They even say it's one of the best reasons to buy a Game Boy Color, which is strong stuff. This page in N64 Magazine, right, it's got a couple of Game Boy Color reviews, proper retro handheld stuff in it. First up there's Suzuki All-Star Extreme Racing. Blimey, 25 quid, that's a bit steep for a Game Boy game back then, wasn't it? Apparently it's from Ubisoft. The review seems quite chuffed with it though, surprised even, calling it a damn fine handheld racer. Says it's like those pseudo 3D driving games where the track goes way off into the distance. Mentions it's fast and smooth and you race as Suzuki and can unlock more bikes and tracks and all that. They reckon the handling is a bit like Super Hang-On, so you can chuck your bike about a bit. And it's got a fog effect, depth cued fog. Fancy that for a Game Boy. Sounds alright actually, they gave it a 4 out of 5, better than Top Gear Rally apparently. Then underneath is Gex Deep Cover Gecko. That's the Gecko geezer, wasn't he? From Eidos, 20 quid this one. They're going on about the N64 Gecko-X game, being a bit rubbish but saying the 2D ones are better. It's got his channel surfing thing, different costumes, he can stick to walls and whack things with his tail, bit of a weirdo. Says it's not got loads of powers like Mario or Kirby, which is fair enough, they call it competently done but uninspired. Bit lukewarm really. Big levels and missions, and apparently watching Gex go splat after a big fall is a highlight. Only gets a 3 out of 5 stars though, so maybe not a must-have. Still, remember Gex, eh? Proper blast from the past. This page in Planet Game Boy, yeah, takes me right back. They're having a look at David O'Leary's Total Soccer and Mission Impossible for the good old Game Boy. Total Soccer is getting a decent 4 out of 5. They're saying if you were into your kickoff or sensible soccer back in the day, this is your sort of thing, especially if you wanted those current team lineups, which was a novelty then. Link Up Play 2 for a bit of multiplayer action. Screenshot of the game looks like classic top-down footy. Mission Impossible is getting a 3 out of 5. Apparently it's a different beast to the N64 version, more about sneaking about, and it's got this personal organizer built in, even infrared for sending messages. A bit of a gadgety thing for a secret agent game, maybe a bit too much. Screenshot looks like some isometric sneaky business. This page reviews a couple of stone-cold classics for the Game Boy. First up, it's Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man in one cartridge. Acclaim are asking 20 quid each for these. No link up, no color, but yes, they are out now. Apparently Pac-Man was massive back in the day, especially for the kids in the early 80s, and of course Ms. Pac-Man came along later. This is a 2-game set, one for the boys and one for the girls, so they reckon you can play them full screen, or zoomed out a bit to see everything. Each game has a bonus game. Pac-Man has Pac-Attack, which is a Tetris sort of thing, and Ms. Pac-Man is bundled with Super Pac-Man. They reckon it's a confusing version with keys and power pills that make Pac-Man massive and float about. They say it's a nice way to get 2 games on one cart, but it would still be smaller than Conker's cart. Cheeky. They still think they are good retro fun though, giving the Pac-Man/Pac-Attack combo 4 stars, calling it the hottest piece of lipsticked yellow pie. Right then. Next up, it's Space Invaders from Activision, also 20 quid. Password save. Link up is no color. Yes, it's out now. Apparently it's not just your basic Game Boy conversion of the arcade game, it's been given a bit of a dover. It's described as a classy defender, and they reckon it would be easy to ignore it if you're into R-Type DX on the Nintendo, but it's still the daddy of them all. Space Invaders, right, it might not be the first futuristic blaster, but it is still the name most people think of with games. They say it's got a mix of tension and score skill, and they've messed about with it. New invaders that take a few hits to kill, and special weapons like a 3-way laser. They say the shields can be changed, and the invaders come in weird formations, but it still feels like Space Invaders and the new stuff works alright. You also get the original arcade version on the card to compare it to. They give this one 3 stars, saying it's how the game looked 20 years ago and it still plays nicely. There are a few screenshots from both games dotted about the page with some captions pointing out bits and bobs like the yellow star that sucks ghosts in Pac-Man, and that the Space Invader enemies don't look like the original ones. This page from Planet Game Boy Magazine, back when N64 Mag still covered the little handheld, has got a bunch of tips and cheats, and the usual high score bragboard. At the top there's passwords for Bugs and Lola. Remember that game? Bit of a platformer, I think, vaguely Looney Tunesy. Seems you could skip levels using these passwords for the town and space levels on easy and hard modes. Then there's cheat codes for Spy Hunter and Moon Patrol, 2 proper old school arcade games. For Spy Hunter you could get infinite lives and weapons by hammering in some direction buttons, and A. Same sort of thing for Moon Patrol, but with B for weapons. Always good to get those cheat codes, weren't they? Roll. Quest for Camelot, another one I vaguely remember, has tips for free money and health. Digging everywhere with your shovel gets you cash and hearts apparently. And if you're about to die, just find a save point, have over 30 joules, save, and restart to get full health. Clever. Harvest Moon is there too. Proper farming sim that one was. Magic eggs, apparently you can get loads of eggs from one chicken if you throw an egg at the wall and keep whacking it with a sickle. And egg fraud is a tip about conning the animal shop owner for more money for your eggs. Cheeky. There. Then the usual high score bit. Mario Deluxe scores are topped by almost everybody the world, which is a bit of a laugh. Catherine Wakely and Ian Shaw got pretty high scores too, and there's a David Teixeira from New Zealand in there. Tetris DX has some fast times for 40 lines and ultra mode. Richard Ford and Nick Heom seem to be doing well at Tetris. Marathon mode is here too, with some massive scores from Paul Curtis and Richard Ford again, and Anita Gilberg from Sweden. Game & Watch Gallery scores are listed as well. Donkey Kong Parachute Chef Helmet. Jonathan Dene seems to be dominating Donkey Kong and Helmet. Right at the bottom it's asking for your high scores to be sent in to Planet Game Boy at their bath address. Or, you could email them back in '99. They even mention next month we'll have Pokemon pinball scores, so that gives you a time frame. Pretty standard stuff for a gaming mag back then, really. This page then, it's the Game Boy Gallery from Planet Game Boy. It's all about pictures sent in by readers taken with the Game Boy camera. Remember that little gadget? They've got a winner. At the top, some Blair Witch Project inspired thing, apparently gave the reviewer the runs, charming. Then it's just a bunch of reader pics with little captions. Loads of gurning faces. Someone's called Slaphead, bit harsh. There's a dodgy looking Pikachu, an irradiated chicken, someone playing a nose trumpet, and something described as simply awful from Rome. Right bunch of freaks if you ask me, but each to their own, eh? They are asking for more of these freaks to be sent in though, so they must be popular with someone. It's all a bit daft really, proper 90s Game Boy humor. This page in N64 Magazine seems to be all about Super Smash Bros. Finally hitting Blighty. It's about time too. America's had it since February, and Japan even longer. They are calling it the N64's best beat-em-up. Sounds promising. The previously in N64 bit at the top is pondering where the crowd actually sits when you are fighting in the Great Fox stage, which is a bit of a laugh. Typical N64 mag pondering. There are some little screenshot boxes dotted around. One shows Link using his long shot from Ocarina of Time, causing a whole world of hurt apparently, and another is calling it a lightsaber party, with Pikachu in a party hat. Looks like a right old rumble. Another one mentions Gentleman Fox McCloud shooting Link in the back, and Martin, who I guess is one of the reviewers, likes Pikachu because of his electric attacks. There's even a mention of Fox on Fox action, and a joke about Slippy Toad not being included. Someone wants to smack that pathetic frog's face off apparently. And then there's Metal Mario teaching his alter ego a lesson, saying he'll be even happier come Christmas. Tool. The info burst bit is your standard mag stuff. From Nintendo/HAL, cartridge size, how many players 1 to 4, controller and rumble packs check, cartridge save, password save no go, expansion pack no go again, GB pack nope. When's it out, it says, with little flags. USA and Japan are now, and the UK is December. Cost is £40. The main text goes on about how everyone has been waiting for Smash Bros, especially after the We Want Smash Bros appeal they ran, and now with this and Donkey Kong 64, Nintendo reckons they own the millennium. Bit bold, isn't it? It talks about how some people were unsure about a beat-em-up with Mario and his mates, remembering back to when Mario Kart was announced and some gamers were tutting and shaking their heads, but then everyone loved Mario Kart, so they are wondering if the same headshakers will change their tune on this one. They're gonna discover if the fears are justified, so it sounds like a review is coming up. This page is about single-player fun in games, mainly focusing on Super Smash Bros. On the N64. It kicks off talking about Tournament Mode, which sounds like your standard arcade mode, but with a twist. You can batter your way through teams of dummy characters, and then face off against a massive glove as a boss. Bit weird, but alright. Kesufos. Then there's Training Mode, which they say is handy for learning all the combos in Smash Bros. Which, fair enough, there were a few to get your head around. They mention you can mess about with the arena, and the computer opponent's AI, which sounds standard for training but I suppose was a bit of a step up at the time. Apparently smashing Pikachu in the stomach is a highlight. Pleasant stuff. Warinu. Hidden characters gets a mention, teasing that there are 4 secret fighters to unlock by completing the game in a certain way. They even give you a glimpse of silhouettes, but they're being all coy not to spoil the surprise. Very mysterious. 4-player fight section just points out that you can set up fights against computer players in teams or just go free-for-all. Which is what you'd expect really, it's Smash Bros, that's the whole point. Pandal. Lastly, Bonus to Pick talks about the single-player bonus stages where you're breaking targets. They reckon it's better than other one-player modes in beat-em-ups, saying these target stages are quite challenging, and even suggest you might want to deliberately fall off to skip to the next round if you're struggling. Cheeky. They show Yoshi doing his extended jump on a platform, and Fox McCloud showing off his blaster in another target stage. So yeah, all in all, a page about the single-player side of Smash Bros, trying to convince you it's got more to it than just multiplayer brawls. This page in N64 Magazine back in '99 is having a right old go at Super Smash Bros, breaking down a typical match. They've got it titled, Scrap, 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 which is fair enough, sums it up nicely. They're running through a match between Samus and Link, looks like Hyrule Castle stage. Each picture is a little moment, like Samus sneaking a shot on Link, then Link getting his own back with a bomb. Typical Smash Bros chaos really, just smashing each other off the stage. They reckon Smash Bros is full of classic Nintendo charm and that Shigsy-style magic, whoever Shigsy is, probably Miyamoto I guess. They're saying Pikachu being in it shows it's not just another Mario Kart or golf type of thing, it's a proper Nintendo All-Stars brawl. They mention a load of characters like Fox McCloud, Link, Metroid Samus Aran, saying it's a greatest hits collection. Which it kind of was, wasn't it? The reviewer is saying it's got easy controls, no crazy Tekken-style combos, and it's all about knocking your mates off the stage. Sounds about right, doesn't it? They also mention the levels are well designed, like Mario Kart tracks and Mario golf courses, saying they're exquisitely designed. A bit strong maybe, they're alright. They finish off saying it's good for beginners and experts alike, no one's getting totally hammered, which is probably a bit optimistic after a few beers with your mates playing this. All in all, pretty positive review, as you'd expect for a big Nintendo game back then. This page is all about Super Smash Bros. On the N64, looks like a review and a bit of a competition too. Right in the middle there's a big win banner. They're giving away a giant Pikachu plush. You just had to send in a Game Boy camera photo of the game paused. Remember the Game Boy camera? Mad little thing that was. You had to send your entries to their offices in Bath, mind you. Closing date was early January 2000, so a bit late for that now. The review itself is pretty glowing. They've slapped a massive 90% verdict on it. They're calling it a truly original beat-em-up, and reckon Nintendo revitalized the genre again. Positive points are listed as fast, fluid, fun-filled fighting, loads of Nintendo favorites, perfectly designed arenas, and top-notch multiplayer. They do have a couple of minor niggles, mind, saying the analog controls can be a bit fiddly at times, and the camera can be a bit erratic. Fair enough, it was early days for analog sticks really. There's a little box that says, if you like this, and it recommends Fighter's Destiny, says it's the N64's second best fighter. Fighter's Destiny, yeah, it was alright, a bit different with its scoring system, but Smash Bros was definitely in another league. Cheshire. They've given visuals and sounds an 8 out of 10 each, saying the arenas are unremarkable, but the characters are smooth, fast and well animated. Sounds are suitably nasty slapping noises, and top retro Nintendo tunes, which is a good way of putting it. Very catchy music in that game. Mastery gets a 9, saying it's hard to imagine it on any other platform, and Lifespan also gets a 9, calling it one of the N64's best multiplayer games. And yeah, thinking back, we did hammer that game for ages, didn't we? Lunchtimes at work were basically just Smash Bros tournaments for months. Good times. Coring to 9. There's a bunch of screenshots dotted around. You can see Mario, Donkey Kong, Kirby, Yoshi, Samus, all the usual suspects beating each other up. They're even showing off the pause screen trick for the competition. All in all, pretty positive write-up, and rightly so. It was a proper classic game. This page is a review of WCW Mayhem for the N64, back from issue 36, must be late 99 or so. It gets a decent 78% overall. The review starts with the positives, saying it's uncommonly quick and responsive, and the moves are exciting and violent looking, which is fair enough, that's what you wanted in a wrestling game back then. But then it goes on to the negatives, not many match types, presentation's lacking, and it's a bit thin for a single player game. Seems a bit of a mixed bag to start with then. They suggest if you like this you'll like WWF Attitude, which is probably spot on. They were the big wrestling games duking it out. They'd reviewed Attitude in issue 32 and gave it 88%, so it was the clear winner in their eyes. There's a section about fighting outside the ring which they call Step Outside, saying you can brawl in changing rooms, corridors and even the car park, viewed from a security camera with grey graphics. You can use weapons like chairs, and even a kitchen sink apparently. They joke about a law against bashing someone with a porcelain basin. Cheeky. And apparently weapons do quadruple damage. Ouch. The visuals get a 7, saying it's quick but not as pretty as Attitude or Revenge. Which is fair, those acclaimed games were pretty good looking for the time. Sounds get an 8, meaty effects and over-the-top commentary, which is what you expect. Mastery is a 7, saying it's fast but not as deep as other wrestling games. Lifespan is a 7, saying few match types might get boring quickly but multiplayer saves it. The verdict sums it up as fast-paced and unique in the wrestling market, but not as polished or exhaustive as its rivals. Yeah, sounds about right, probably a decent rental, but not a must-have. There's an info burst box that's got all the techie details. 128 megabit cart, 1 to 4 players, needs a controller pack for saving, but no expansion pack or rumble pack needed. Password and cartridge save options, bit old school password save in 99, coming out now in the UK, and December for the US, and they hadn't decided on a price at the time it seems. TBA they've put for cost. Overall, reading it now, seems like a solid, but not amazing wrestling game. Maybe good for a laugh with mates, but not a classic like No Mercy or WrestleMania 2000, which were just around the corner. This page, right then, it's a look at Resident Evil 2 on the N64 from back in N64 Magazine. Seems like Capcom finally decided to jump on the Nintendo bandwagon and surprised everyone by bringing Resi 2 to the console. They were chatting about the bonus quests, yeah, those dead again missions, one with a SWAT bloke and the other with, well, a giant block of tofu armed with a kitchen knife. Mental. They were raving about the pre-rendered backdrops looking amazing even on the N64, and it looks pretty good in those screenshots to be fair, especially considering it's all crammed onto a 512 megabit cartridge. One screenshot shows zombies smashing through a window, another with Claire trapped. Always Claire getting in a pickle. Then there's a delightful image of the first boss who apparently spits cockroaches. Charming. And another bit mentions cockroaches being everywhere, and ADA getting injured. Poor ADA. Leon just legs it and leaves her. What a hero. In the info burst bit it says it's a 512 megabit cart, single player only, cartridge save. You could use the expansion pack and rumble pack, but no controller pack, or GB pack support, whatever that was. Apparently it was out now in the US, December in the UK, and January in Japan, and cost a hefty 50 quid. 50 quid! Games were expensive back then, weren't they? They were wondering how Capcom managed to squeeze all those pre-rendered cutscenes onto the cart, and if it actually worked. Seems like they were pretty impressed they even managed to get it running on the N64 at all, considering it came from the PlayStation originally. Good old Resi 2. Simpler times. This page takes you back to the late 90s in N64 Magazine, and it's all about Resident Evil 2. In it, they've got a feature called Ghost House, which is about the Raccoon City police station bit at the start of Resi 2. They're saying it's like a zombie version of Zelda's Hyrule Field, which is a bit of a reach, but you get the idea, puzzles and keys and all that malarkey in a police station overrun with zombies. Apparently the RPD officers aren't as squeaky clean as they look, which is a surprise, right? War. Then there's a Battle of the Sexes bit, talking about playing as either Leon or Claire. Same basic story apparently, but different paths through the game. Claire gets the grenade launcher, and Leon bumps into some mysterious woman called Ada. Sounds like classic Resi, to be fair. Finally, they've got a bit called Crocodile Hunter, which is about dealing with the crocodile boss. They've got a secret way to beat it using gas canisters, which back then was the sort of info you lapped up in mags like this. Kaboom! They reckon it's a beauty. Yeah, maybe if you like big lizards chomping on ya. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine is having a look at Resident Evil 2 on the N64, and blimey, it was something else back then, wasn't it? They're banging on about the graphics looking amazing with the expansion pack, and to be fair, for the time, it was pretty impressive seeing Leon and his zombie mates looking so sharp. There's a section called Make the Undead Dead, which goes through the weapons you get to use. The knife apparently is rubbish, who knew? The pistol is a bit pants too, only good for shooting birds it seems. Then you've got the shotgun, which is noisy but does the job, the Magnum for when things get really messy, and a flamethrower, which they jokingly say is good for burning living shrubbery. Cheeky. The Creepshow bit is all about the zombies, and they're not holding back on the gore. Apparently there's all sorts of nasty types, including naked zombies and ones that crawl around with no legs. Lovely. They even mention giant spiders and moths. Nice. Apparently the violence is a bit much even for them, calling it excessively gory. Remember all the fuss about that back then? Lastly, they touch on the visuals, saying about the pre-rendered cutscenes and camera angles being top-notch. They do have a bit of a moan about the controls being a bit clunky, saying the rotate and run thing feels a bit old hat, even by 99 standards. But overall they reckon it's still a proper, scary and absorbing game, and yeah, it really was, wasn't it? Proper jump scares and all that. This page is a review of Resident Evil 2 on the N64, from what looks like a magazine back in '99. Right at the top they've got N64 Arena splashed across it, and it's all about Resident Evil 2. Looks like they're giving it a good going over. Magazine. There's a pluses and minuses bit, listing the good stuff like calling it the scariest game you'll ever play, with stunning graphics for the time, fast 3D, and even pre-rendered cutscenes which they were quite proud of back then on the N64. On the minus side they mentioned fiddly controls, which wasn't a surprise on the N64 pad for some games, old-fashioned controls, and that it's only a few hours to play, which for back then wasn't a massive issue unless you were expecting an epic RPG. They've got a section called If You Like This, recommending Shadow Man from Acclaim, saying it's a similarly adult adventure and absolutely massive. Shadow Man was alright, a bit dark and moody, trying to be all grown up. Then they break it down into visuals and sounds, both getting a 9 out of 10, saying eye-popping graphics and huge atmospheric sound and scary zombie noises. Mastery gets an 8, mentioning 2 CDs worth of PlayStation game crammed onto one cart, which was always impressive at the time. Lifespan gets a 7, saying the main quest is short, but the bonus missions are a bit repetitive. The main article talks about how we'd been spoiled by PlayStation graphics and character acting, mentioning Acclaim's Shadow Man again as a benchmark. They take a bit of a dig at Resi 2's cutscenes, saying Leon's reactions are a bit wooden when someone dies, you know, the classic "oh man" sort of thing. They say it's unintentionally hilarious at times. Gameplay-wise, they say the zombies are genuinely frightening, lunging at you, and that the game has proper hair-raising moments, remembering the good old zombie dogs through the window shock tactic. They mention the puzzles and item management, having to find cogwheels and broken clocks, all the usual Resi stuff, and being careful with ammo because it's hard to come by. They admit some rooms aren't that pretty to look at, but others are lovely. The verdict at the bottom gives it a massive 90% and a Star Game award. They reckon despite the controls showing their age, this N64 conversion is scary, gory, and gripping. Overall, sounds like they really liked it, despite a few minor gripes about acting and length. For an N64 conversion of a PlayStation Classic, 90% was pretty amazing back then, you know. This page is all about WWF WrestleMania 2000 for the N64, proper wrestling game this was shaping up to be back then. It's got a big splash across the middle of the page, WWF WrestleMania 2000 in massive letters, you couldn't miss it. They reckon if you know your wrestling you'll be able to do a better job than the scriptwriters, which is a bit cheeky. Sounds like they're pushing the pay-per-view mode, where you can set up your own massive wrestling events with loads of wrestlers, cage matches, tag team, three-way bouts, the works. You could even get 4 players involved for a proper Royal Rumble feel in pay-per-view, Bagsy being stone cold they say. There are a few screenshots showing wrestlers like The Rock and what looks like Triple H doing their thing in the ring. One of the captions mentions The Brood making their entrance and someone's shirt. Another one says moves like planches are simple and that the crowds and arenas are miles better than other N64 wrestling games. A bit of cheeky bragging there. Down in the corner there's an infoburst bit, looks like the game is coming out on December 3rd in the UK and US, but TBA for Japan. Cartridge size is 128 megabit, which was pretty hefty back then. It's for 1 to 4 players, and uses 17 pages on the controller pack, but no password save, cartridge save only, and no expansion pack, rumble pack or GB pack support. Cost is £40, which was standard for a new N64 game, a decent chunk of pocket money back then. Overall, it's looking like a solid wrestling game, lots of grapples, pile drivers and lycra. Can't beat 'em they reckon. A bit of alright fun for Christmas, if you were a wrestling fan. This page in N64 Magazine back in '99 is having a look at WWF WrestleMania 2000 on the N64. They're saying that after WWF Attitude, which they reckon was just a bit dodgy, this one actually proves that wrestling games can be alright. Apparently it's got better graphics, a decent creator-player mode, and loads of wrestlers to choose from. They're banging on about how you can use weapons from ringside flight cases, stop signs, even barbed wire baseball bats. Sounds a bit daft really, but I suppose that's wrestling for you. There's something called Glee Play, they mention, which is like an instant replay for when you do something good, or flatten someone with a pile driver. Charming. The review talks about the single-player mode called Road to WrestleMania, where you start at the bottom and work your way up, and all the different match types like cage matches and Royal Rumbles, which were always a bit of a laugh with your mates. They reckon the wrestlers look more like themselves this time, not like they've been stretched out of shape, so that's a plus I suppose. It mentions all the different factions as well, like the Ministry and the Brood, remember them? Mad times. There are some screenshots with little captions, bit of a laugh, and a picture of someone dressed as the Godfather, looking a bit much as usual. Overall they seem to think it's a decent wrestling game, not setting the world on fire, but better than the last one at least. This page from N64 Magazine is having a look at WWF WrestleMania 2000 on the N64. It seems like they are quite impressed, giving it a whopping 90%, which is a great score back then. In the pluses and minuses section they reckon it's got loads of options, superb visuals and a good career mode, plus you can smack people with dustbins, which is always a laugh. On the downside, they think the energy bars recover a bit too quickly and some wrestlers are already looking a bit dated. They suggest if you liked WCW/NWO Revenge, you'll probably like this, saying it's a flawed but fun GR Applefest from the same people, THQ. Remember Revenge? That was alright for a bit of a button basher with your mates. They've given visuals, sounds and mastery all 8 out of 10, and lifespan a 9. Visually they say it's not highers, but the characters look like their real-life counterparts. Which is fair enough, you could tell who was who. Sound is good, especially the entrance music. And mastery is better than the WCW games, with tons of grapples to learn. Lifespan gets a good score because there are loads of modes and multiplayer options to keep you going. Warrington Nugs. There's a bit about the creator wrestler mode called Monster Man, saying it's got all the usual customization bits and bobs you'd expect, letting you tweak your wrestler's look, entrance moves, and even give them ring entrance accessories like a tongfa, a head, or a pet bottle. Charming. Overall, the verdict is that it's a highly impressive WWF debut on the N64 from THQ, and a good alternative to Acclaim's WWF Attitude. They reckon it's one of the best wrestling games yet, rivaling Attitude for features and options, even if it's not doing anything massively new. Oliver Hurley's the reviewer, giving it a big thumbs up and a 90%. Not bad at all. The next page here in N64 Magazine is all about Roadsters. Right then, Roadsters. It seems like they were previewing it in the previous issue, calling it fresh and funky. The reviewer here starts off a bit sarcastic, saying on paper it looks like a recipe for disaster, using an engine from Automobili Lamborghini and made by the team who did Superman on the 64, which wasn't exactly a classic, was it? But surprisingly, they actually reckon it's alright. Da business even, according to one of the little speech bubbles. They mention the characters, particularly someone called Mr. Slim, who's a bit of a Hannibal Lecter type apparently, giving people the finger when he overtakes. Charming. The tracks are described as crisp and well designed, although maybe a bit too clean looking. Gameplay-wise, it sounds like it starts off a bit slow with basic cars like a piddly Alfa Romeo, but once you get further in and unlock faster motors, things get much better. They say the CPU cars are really aggressive, trying to shunt you off the road and generally being right GITS, which apparently makes for good racing in multiplayer. Taka. In the info burst box, it says it's from Titus, 128 megabit cart, 1 to 4 players, needs 7 pages on the controller pack, and Rumble pack is a yes. Looks like it's out now in the UK and US, and TBA for Japan, costing £40. Verdict seems pretty positive overall, calling it brilliantly smooth, commendably fast and heavy, with a technically tidy multiplayer mode, even if it's not perfect. Not bad for a driving game back then, I suppose. This page from the magazine is having a look at roadsters on the N64, and it's calling it shunting season, which is a bit of a laugh. It's broken down into seasons like a championship, starting with Season 1, where you're stuck with the Category C motors and only the basic tracks, mostly in dry weather. Season 2 unlocks a couple more tracks, Docklands and Lumbermill, and you get to use Category B cars, and the weather gets a bit trickier on the old tracks. Season 3 is where you can use the top-end Category A cars, assuming you've earned enough dosh from the previous seasons. They've got these pluses and minuses boxes. On the plus side, it reckons it's got loads of A sports cars, brain-melting top speeds, upgrades and buying and selling, and a solid multiplayer mode. The minuses are less polite, saying there's hideous reversing, not enough tracks, and huge turning circles. Bit harsh maybe. Down the side they've got little ratings for different bits. Visuals gets an 8, saying it's colourful and flashy, but not quite World Driver standard. Sounds get a mediocre 5, moaning about the engine noises, but admitting the music is alright. Mastery gets another 8, praising the fact it keeps going smoothly even with 8 cars on screen. Lifespan is a 7, noting there are stacks of cars but not enough tracks, even with this season thing. The review goes on about how the more you play roadsters the better it gets, but you start noticing the dodgy bits, like the CPU cars out in front magically staying ahead. And they moan about going off track onto the grass and sand which stops you dead. Yeah, we've all been there, haven't we? They also have a pop at a corner in the game, calling it the worst, a U-bend with ice that slows you down. They mention the multiplayer is good, especially 2-player, and that the track detail in roadsters is top-notch. They reckon London is a terrible corner, but the rest is rip-roaring long straights. The verdict at the bottom says it's well behind World Driver in terms of quality, and a bit rough around the edges, but still good fun. It gets a score of 80%, which isn't bad going really, and it recommends World Driver Championship and even Gran Turismo on the PlayStation if you like this sort of thing, calling Gran Turismo the N64's very own Gran Turismo, which is a bit confusing. It says to check out last issue's tips, so I guess they were raving about that one then. This page in N64 Magazine issue 36 is having a look at Rocket, Robot on Wheels. Seems like a bit of a quirky platformer from Ubisoft. It's got this feature called Theme Park Larks, showing you how to build your own roller coaster in the game, which is a bit different, isn't it? Apparently you collect screws on the first level, and then you can use the analog stick and the A and B buttons to create loops and raise or lower the track. If your coaster's deemed good enough, you get Whoopie World tickets, which I guess are important. Sounds a bit fiddly, but maybe fun if you're into that sort of thing. The info burst bit gives us the key details. Rocket, Robot on Wheels, is from Ubisoft, naturally. It's a 128 megabit cart, single player, and uses cartridge save, which is handy. Rumble pack is supported, but no controller pack, expansion pack or GB pack. It was due out on December 3rd in the UK and US, and TBA in Japan, priced at £40. But no content no. The overall headline says, third time unlucky for Ubisoft. Not quite, which suggests maybe their previous N64 games haven't been barnstormers. But they seem to be hinting this one might be alright. They mention, paint misbehaving has a definite Roman feel, and inside the funhouse on Clowney Island, watch out for the bee. Sounds like your typical oddball platformer of the time, could be a hidden gem, or just another one lost in the N64 library. We'll have to see, I suppose. They also mention hoversplat and paintball, and shooting and hovering, so maybe there's more to it than just coaster building. This page in N64 Magazine right, it's having a look at Rocket, Robot on Wheels. Remember that one? Sucker Punch's first game apparently, blimey. They were a new developer at the time, so I guess they were keen to make a good impression. They were saying at first they were a bit meh about another Ubisoft platformer, especially after Tonic Trouble and Rayman 2, which were alright but nothing to write home about really. But they were pleasantly surprised with Rocket, saying it was a cracking little game. They're comparing it to Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie, which is high praise indeed back then. They reckon it's inventive and full of rewarding stuff to do, which sounds about right from what I vaguely remember. The review mentions the physics and the vehicles, and how you can mess about with a paint gun. Apparently you collect Tinker tokens to get new moves, and you can use a tractor beam. Sounds a bit bonkers. The levels are supposed to be fairly small but packed with things to do, like racing computer cars in hot dog mobiles, and messing with robotic chickens. Typical N64 madness really. They do say jumping can be a bit tricky, and the camera isn't always perfect, which was a common moan in 3D games back then, wasn't it? And they point out it came out at the same time as Donkey Kong 64, which is a bit of a tough break really. Under pluses and minuses, they liked that it was original, had loads to do, was great fun, and a darn good 3D platformer. Minuses were tricky jumping and the camera, and that Donkey Kong 64 release date clash. If you like this section recommends Banjo-Kazooie, no surprises there, everyone loved Banjo-Kazooie. They've given it scores out of 10 in different bits, visuals and sounds getting a 7, mastery and lifespan getting an 8, and an overall verdict of 88%. Not bad at all. And there's a bit about a puzzle in the paint misbehaving level, with a Centurion guard and some coloured pools to dip your robot's wheel in to get past him and grab a ticket. Typical puzzle game stuff. Yeah, Rocket Robot on Wheels, it was a decent game, a bit overlooked maybe, especially coming out when it did. This page in N64 Magazine, bless them, it's a right roasting of Carmageddon 64. They've headlined it, "This one sneaked into the shops. Can't imagine why," which pretty much tells you all you need to know straight away. Apparently they previewed it before and already thought it was a repugnant turd of a game, back on the N64 32, whatever that was supposed to be. The pluses and minuses bit is brutal. The only plus they could scrape together is "move along, nothing to see here," which is hardly a ringing endorsement, is it? Then it's just a pile of minuses: terrible handling, hilariously rubbish AI, no track maps, dissolving zombies with wooden legs, useless weapons and fuzzy graphics. Charming. If you did happen to like this sort of thing, they suggest Vigilante 8 as a much better option, or really any game ever made. Bit harsh on Carmageddon 64 you might think, but then you see the score, a delightful 8%. 8%? The reviewer suggests if you actually see this game in shops, you should take it off the shelf and destroy it. Sounds like they really weren't keen. There's a little info burst box with techie details, like it being a 64 megabits cart, 1 or 2 players, and all the pack compatibility stuff if you were bothered. And then a section called Messing About in the River, which highlights some of the quality gameplay you could expect, like falling in the river and somehow driving along the riverbed, getting lost, and CPU cars just randomly rolling backwards. Sounds like a right laugh, not quads. Honestly, reading this, it brings back memories of some absolute stinkers that used to sneak onto shelves back in the day. Carmageddon on the PC was alright for a bit of mindless fun, but it sounds like this N64 version was a complete and utter disaster. They even admit they pride themselves on finishing games at N64 Magazine, but they just couldn't manage this one. "Play it and you'll see," they say. No thanks, I think I'll take their word for it. 8% ouch. The next page here is a review for Paperboy on the N64. Blimey, Paperboy in 3D, who'd have thought it? It's talking about how it's a 64-bit update to the old arcade game, bringing it into the modern era, well 1999 modern that is. They're saying it's a bit weird and wonderful, black and white, you're either a subscriber, or the enemy. Sounds a bit dramatic for delivering papers. Porky. Apparently you get to ride around on your bike in a 3D world, delivering papers, and smashing windows if people aren't subscribers. It mentions training areas to learn stunts and tricks. The reviewer reckons it can be a bit tricky, and you'll end up wiping out a fair bit. They say the stunts aren't really worth the risk for the points, a bit pointless and gimmicky. But they admit if you liked the old arcade Paperboy, and can put up with some slightly dated graphics, which, let's be honest, they are a bit blocky even for the time, then you might enjoy it for a bit. They reckon you'll probably finish it in a couple of evenings. There's a pluses and minuses box that says it has fully interactive backgrounds and bonus games, which is good. But on the downside they think it's way too easy, gets repetitive, and the gameplay enhancements aren't that great. Down at the bottom they've given it a verdict of 62%, saying it's good fun while it lasts. Fair enough score really. Then there's a bit that says, "If you like this," and suggests Snowboard Kids, saying it's like a faster version of Paperboy. Snowboard Kids. Now that was a laugh, wasn't it? But yeah, Paperboy in 3D, a bit of a blast from the past for a quick go, but probably not something you'd be playing for months on end. This page has a look at South Park Chef's Louvre Shack. It seems like they previewed it, saying it's a flat-out party game after the first South Park game, which they weren't too chuffed about. They reckon Love Shack is better than that original South Park N64 game though, thankfully. Apparently it's got mini-games like Mario Party, and includes about 8 characters from the show. They say it's easy to pick up and play, and might be worth the 40 quid asking price. There's a bit at the start about Pac-Man and expansion packs, saying it doesn't make any difference to Love Shack if you have one plugged in or not. Visually they reckon it's alright, but nothing special. Graphics were never going to be its strong point, like they say about most games on the N64. Bit cheeky, yeah, to gay. The screenshots show the character selection screen with Eric, Stan, Kyle and Kenny, looking very much like their telly counterparts. Then there's a quiz game with aliens and Chef, and another minigame where Kyle is betting with Mr. Hanky. They mention some minigame names like Avalanche Stampede, Go-Karts, Bees at the Picnic and Snowforts from another screenshot on the page which they call Minigame Madness. The info burst bit says it's from Acclaim, is 128 megabit, for 1 to 4 players and has a Rumble Pack feature, and was due out in December in the UK, so probably just in time for Christmas that year, 1999. This page then, it's all about South Park, Chef's Love Shack on the N64, back in '99. So, first up is questions. It's your basic quiz mode in it, general knowledge and South Park stuff. Looks like you pick a category, snack cakes, potpourri. Charming. They reckon you need to have watched loads of episodes of Mastermind to do well, blimey, that's a bit keen. Then there's Double Down, sounds a bit like Catchphrase, or one of those quiz shows. You gamble your points but don't actually get to see the question if you bottle it. Bit pointless really. Next up, Wheel of Fortuitousness. Wheel of Fortune but South Parkified. Apparently you can lose loads of points on this, so spinning it fast is the way to go. Sounds like a right button masher. And finally, Pressure Round. 10 questions on Harry and Harry. Not sure who they are. Some cartoon fellas, I suppose. If you get it wrong, Cartman does something unpleasant. Probably involves fart noises, knowing South Park. Oh, and there's a bit about the chef's theme tune, simultaneous louving. They're proper keen on it. Reckon you should stick it on when conversation lulls at Christmas dinner. Maybe a bit much for the relatives, eh? This page delves into a game called Love Shack for the N64, and blimey, it looks a bit of alright, doesn't it? It's a party game, like Mario Party but with a South Park twist, and from the looks of it, it's right up my street. The reviewer seems to think it's a bit of a laugh, even if it is a bit cheeky, saying the questions are scorching and full of poo humour, which, let's be honest, is South Park in a nutshell. They mention a Mr. Yankee complaining that the quiz questions are too American, which is fair enough. We Brits do struggle with all that Super Bowl nonsense. They've got screenshots of some of the mini-games. There's one where you're herding cows called Stampede, another one with Bees at a Picnic which looks a bit like Galaxians, there's a go-karting one, and another one called Avalanche. One screenshot shows Chef in a quiz setting, asking about Mr. Hat and Brett Favre, proper random stuff. Another screen shows the category selection with titles like West Side Story and Chilling Con Carnies, so you get the idea of the humour. The reviewer reckons the mini-games are decent enough, even if some are a bit simple, and mentions they are reminiscent of old retro games, which is probably true for most of these party games. They say there are 22 mini-games, which isn't bad, but they also worry you might end up playing the same ones over and over, which is a fair point for this type of game. All in all, Love Shack sounds like it could be a good bit of fun with mates, especially if you're into South Park's brand of humour. Might be worth a rent from Blockbuster, eh? This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at South Park, Chef's Love Shack. Remember that one? It's a minigame compilation, proper party game fodder, from back in '99. They've highlighted a few of the minigames in little boxes at the top. Parachute jump. Sounds a bit simple, just jumping out of a plane and tapping A. Then there's Asses in Space. Sounds like asteroids with a South Park twist. Pizza delivery is like Paperboy, lobbing pizzas about. And Bad Kitty is something with Cartman's cat and dodgeballs. Sounds a bit daft, to be honest. The main bit of text goes on about how surprisingly they managed to get loads of South Park characters in the game, even though Acclaim weren't always the best at that sort of thing. It mentions Love Shack itself, and how characters like Cartman, Kyle, Stan, Kenny, and even Mr. Mackey are playable. Looks like you're answering questions from Chef, and there's a quiz show vibe to it all. Down the side they've got a little pluses and minuses box, saying good points are brilliant minigames, loads of questions, sampled speech and fart gags naturally. The bad points are not enough to do on your own, flawed multiplayer, and it can be a bit lonely if you are playing single player. They've got a if you like this bit pointing to Mario Party, which is fair enough comparison. Then they've given it scores out of 10 almost. Visuals get a 5, sounds a 9, mastery a 7, and lifespan a 7. The verdict is a decent 83%, saying it's fun and cleverly simple, and takes all the best bits from South Park and makes a fun quiz show. Tim Weaver is the reviewer, signing off there. Yeah, not a bad little party game for its time, Loof Shack. This page in N64 Magazine, issue 36, takes a look at LEGO Racers. Right then, LEGO Racers. Northtra. Remember this one? They're calling it a chunky dream car game. Which is about right. It's like Mario Kart, but you get to build your own cars out of LEGO. They reckon that's the best bit, the car construction kit. You pick a basic chassis, and then just stick on extra bricks you've earned. Apparently, these bricks affect your car's speed and handling, which is a nice touch. And you can even get a driving license photo in the game, for your custom driver. Fancy. Jesu. Looking at the pluses and minuses box, they reckon the good bits are building your own cars, weapon upgrades, and that it looks cute. Yeah, it's LEGO, it's gonna look cute, innit? The bad points are iffy handling, frustrating opponents, and no 4-player mode. No 4-player, that's a bit of a downer for a karting game back in '99. There's a bit called If You Like This, and it mentions Penny Racers on the N64, giving it 58%. Says it's slow and dull, but the only other racer with customization. Ouch. Poor Penny Racers. Visuals get a 7 out of 10, they say. It looks like LEGO, that's for sure. Can't argue with that. Sounds are a 6. A few tinky tunes and squeaky voices. Mastery also gets a 6, saying car design is brilliant, but the handling isn't. Lifespan gets a 7, you'll want to win all the different LEGO sets apparently. The verdict is that it's an above-average karting clone, with original ideas. They admit it's no Mario Kart, but still fun. Overall it gets a 70%. So not amazing, but decent enough for a bit of LEGO racing. Looks like it was out in the UK and US now for about £40. TBA for Australia. Standard N64 pricing really. This page in N64 Magazine issue 36 is having a look at Xena, Warrior Princess, Talisman of Fate on the N64. It seems they've previewed it before, in issue 35, and are back for another go. The reviewer isn't exactly blown away by the training mode, calling it a bit basic, just a dumb computer opponent. They mention there are only 3 AI types, standing, defending, and full-on scrapping, and no move list to help you out. Still, they grudgingly admit Titus, the developer, bothered to put in a training mode at all, having a dig at a claim for not always including them. Looking at the screenshots, they point out Lucy Lawless, obviously playing Xena, kicking someone called Sky, and there's talk of experiencing a fair amount of pain. Another screenshot shows Caesar getting a sword in the gut, with a comment about fancy lighting effects but no blood. Shame, they say, with a bit of sarcasm. There's a bit about the camera in multiplayer being a bit dodgy, making things a bit wee, which is a funny way of putting it. They also mention that Joxer is as hilariously bumbling in the game as he is in the TV show, so fans of the series might appreciate that. Towards the bottom, they're talking about the arenas being large and good for sparkly projectile moves. One screenshot has a character called Alinrus fighting. They even quote a line from the game, "You want us to do what? Take that, you bounder." Sounds a bit cheesy, typical game dialogue of the time, eh? The info burst box gives us the techie stuff. It's from Titus, a 128 megabit cart, for 1 to 4 players. Controller pack takes up 1 page. Cartridge save is a big cross, so no saving to the cartridge. Password save also a no. Expansion pack isn't needed. Rumble pack is a yes, but GB pack is a no. It was out now in the UK and US, but TBA for Japan and cost £40. A hefty price back then. Overall, it's a typical preview, a bit critical, a bit sarcastic, but gives you a decent idea of what to expect from the Xena game. This page right then, it's got a feature called Fighting Talk, all about special moves in that Xena game, Warrior Princess Talisman of Fate on the N64. They've highlighted a few specials, you know, the kind you'd try to pull off to impress your mates. Ari's has got a Circle of Fire. Sounds a bit flashy. Caesar's got a Crowd Quake, which is probably just a ground pound. Xena's Mad Kicking is described as improbable mid-air leg stabbing lovely, and then there's Despair with a Fire Boulder. They reckon Xena's specials are easy to pull off, which is always a bonus. Then there's a bigger bit underneath called Or Princess, where they're talking about the game overall. Seems they're a bit surprised it's actually alright, considering most games based on teleshows back then were a bit rubbish. They mention South Park as a decent one, but then rattle off some shockers like Jeopardy, Wheel of Fortune, and even Superman games as being terrible. So they're saying Xena is a pleasant surprise, and a decent beat-em-up for the N64. They go on about the plot being a bit rushed but sticking to the show, and all the characters are from it. Sound-wise, apparently the screams and grunts are spot on, and Xena's tongue-wobbling trill scream is the best, whatever that is. They moan a bit that the voice acting isn't the actual cast, but say Titus, who probably published it, were a bit tight with their money. Gameplay-wise, they compare it to Mortal Kombat, kick-punching style, high speed. They talk about combos, button mashing, and say it's quite intuitive to play, and you can string together custom combos, mixing up head, chest and leg blows. Sounds alright for the time, I suppose. Not groundbreaking stuff, but for a Xena game on the N64, maybe better than expected. This page from N64 Magazine back in '99, it's all about Xena, Warrior Princess, the Talisman of Fate, on the N64, remember that one? It was trying to cash in on the telly show, of course, so they've got the usual pluses and minuses box, listing things like fast tactical fighting as a good point, and 4-player being a bit of a mess as a bad point. Sounds about right for a lot of these arena fighters at the time. Juku. They go through the game modes. There's story mode, which is your typical arcade ladder, where you fight a bunch of blokes, and then a final boss, Despair, who sounds like a right laugh. Then versus mode, for up to 4 players battling it out, and roster, which sounds like a team battle thing where you can swap characters during a fight, which is a bit different. Visually, they reckon it's a bit bland, but gets better with the expansion pack. Remember those? Made everything a bit sharper, didn't they? Sound-wise, apparently, there are plenty of screams and grunts and bassy sound effects, which is always good in a beat-em-up, innit? Mastery and lifespan both get a 7 out of 10. They say it's a run-of-the-mill fighter, but with 3D arenas. And 15 minutes for a 1-player game, longer if you're with mates. They reckon you only need to play it once to see everything, so not much replay value then, basically. The verdict is, there are more comprehensive beat-em-ups out there, but Xena offers fast, frantic fighting. Recommended. Gets an 81% in the end. They even compare it to Mortal Kombat 4, saying Xena is speedy and supremely violent. And they mention it's not as good as Fighter's Destiny or Super Smash Bros., which, let's be honest, was a high bar to clear. They also have a little dig at TV tie-in games usually being rubbish, but reckon this one is alright for a bit of fun when your mates are over. Yeah, sounds about right for a rental then. This page in N64 Magazine issue 36 takes a look at Worms Armageddon. Right at the top there's a little previously in N64 section, reminding us about a girder trick for veteran Worms players to outsmart the computer AI, clever stuff back then, and mentions they've been getting to grips with the game in previous issues 32, 33 and 34. The main part of the page is all about Worms Armageddon Classic Multi-Invertebrate Killfest. They're highlighting the fun with one single-player mode, saying it's the first Worms game with a decent single-player experience. There are sections on training, missions and deathmatch. Training is talked about as exercises to hone your worming skills, with ninja ropes and grenades, and even baffling super sheep racing. Missions are solo affairs, described as brilliantly varied, involving assassinating enemy captains, retrieving secret weapons, and ninja worming behind enemy lines, saying the clock is always ticking and later levels are incredibly tough. Deathmatch mode is explained as team-based with 6 worms, getting harder as you improve, and unlike multiplayer, your stats and rank increase, so there's always something to work towards apparently. There's an info burst box with all the details, saying it's from Infogrames, 128 megabits cart, 1 to 4 players, cartridge save, Rumble Pack supported and it was out now, in the UK and US for £40, and TBA for Japan. So pretty standard stuff you'd expect from a game review page back then. A few screenshots of worms doing wormy things in various cartoonish landscapes are scattered around the page, all quite colourful and explosive looking. Overall, it seems like they are pretty hyped for this Worms game. Sounds alright, I suppose, if you're into that sort of thing. This page in N64 Magazine from back in '99 Christmas issue it looks like, features a look at Worms Armageddon. It's titled, A View to a Kill. Bit dramatic, eh? They're showcasing a typical chaotic turn in a Worms match with numbered screenshots and captions, like some sort of cartoon strip. It starts with Worms being parachuted into a bizarre landscape, classic Worms intro really, then it goes through different scenarios, a shotgun blast, someone getting knocked off the edge, the baseball bat making an appearance, and a worm ending up in the drink. You get the idea, standard Worms mayhem. The reviewer, under the heading DDON, is talking about Worms Armageddon being either really annoying or brilliant multiplayer fun, depending on your taste. They mention tactical brainpower, dynamite, and the general glee of sending a worm flying. He says if that's your thing, you'll enjoy it. Then he goes on about how you take your turn, wait for the other player, hoping you don't get caught out. He mentions the game is tactical, needing planning, and that sometimes you have to sacrifice a worm for the greater good. He also notes that no two games are ever the same, Which is true, the randomly generated landscapes always made it interesting. There's a section about option lights saying the gameplay options are a bit sparse, you can't really mess with weapon lists or starting items, but there are still some interesting options to find. They mention taking turns placing worms, rushing for high ground and donor cards, which I vaguely remember being a thing. Another bit is about sounds, saying you can choose voice samples for your team when you create them. They describe it as a turn-based action game, with about 60 seconds per turn to move and attack, using items from your huge arsenal. They make a point about single player being a bit weak, as the computer is a bit too good, always finding the perfect shot. But overall they say Worms Armageddon is a huge improvement, with missions and brainpower being key. They mention it's like Lemmings in a way, and getting a good score earns you extra abilities like laser sights and flamethrowers. They list weapons like the exploding cow, multi-warhead mortar, toxic skunk, and finger of God, all the usual silly Worms weaponry. It sounds like they're pretty positive about it overall, saying it's full of ruinously powerful extras. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine back in the day is having a look at Worms Armageddon. Right then, everyone was pretty hyped for Worms, wasn't they? It reckons it's got good single-player puzzles, which was alright, and some decent new weapons and loads of multiplayer fun, which, let's be honest, is what Worms was always about, down the pub or at your mates. On the downside, no zoom mode, a few gadgets that aren't up to much, and 8-letter names, which is a bit of a weird thing to moan about. They're banging on about the weapons, flamethrower, mortar, minigun, that sort of thing, saying they are the best. Then there's the Geneva Convention bit, about cheating gadgets like jetpacks. Sounds like they think they're a bit much and spoil the tactical side. Which is fair enough, some of those things could be a bit game-breaking. They even say banned weapons, bit strong that, isn't it? There's a bunch of screenshots showing worms blowing each other up with bazookas and grenades, you know the drill. One bit shows a worm drowning, and another with suicide bombers, charming stuff. And a cluster bomb suggestion, which is always a laugh. If you liked Mario Party, apparently you might like this, which is a bit of a stretch, but I guess they both had that multiplayer party game vibe, even if Mario Party was Nintendo, and all a bit more family-friendly, wasn't it? They marked it down for visuals being simple sprites, but the animations are good, sounds are meant to be good with voice samples and screams, mastery is basic stuff, and lifespan is tough missions in multiplayer. The verdict is pretty glowing, calling it incredibly violent but incredibly cute, and a welcome addition to the N64's 4-player game library. They've given it a solid 85%, so not bad at all. They reckon it's one of the most original 4-player games you could buy, and they liked the voice samples and team customization, but moan about the 8-letter name limit again. Bit of a weird hill to die on that one. Overall, sounds like they thought it was a good laugh, which it was, wasn't it? Worms Armageddon, yeah, good times. This page right then, it's a spread from, must be N64 Magazine or something similar, back in the day, probably Christmas '99, looking at the little tree there. First up, we've got a review of a game called Rat Attack. Bloke called Jess Bickham gave it a once-over. Seems like it's a simple puzzle game where you catch rats with traps, made by Mindscape. The screenshots look a bit garish, someone in the review even mentions the appalling color scheme. They're saying it's not amazing to look at, visually only average, but the sounds are alright, squeaky rats and jolly tunes apparently. Mastery is simple, lifespan's boosted by multiplayer, and the verdict is it's simple but well-made button-bashing fun. 70% it got, which is a decent enough score. 40 quid it was going for, that's your Christmas money gone right there. GXE. Then underneath, there's NFLQBC 2000. Duff Yankee Footy Update, says it all really, doesn't it? Martin Kitts reviewed this one and he's not impressed. A claim of the publisher. Graphics are sharp, but the animation is dodgy. Glitches all over the shop. Camera angles are rubbish, messing with the gameplay. Sounds are alright, crowd noises and commentary getting an 8 out of 10. Visuals are 7, but the gameplay or mastery only got a 5. Verdict is something went wrong at the developers. Stick with QBC 99, that was the better game. 60% this one scored. Also 40 quid. So yeah, bit of a mixed bag on this page. Rats may be worth a look. American football one sounds like a right stinker though. This page in N64 Magazine has a look at a couple of games, starting with Hot Wheels. Seems like they reckon it's very good in a slightly sarcastic way. Sacked? It's that typical American-style racing game, a bit like San Francisco Rush but with Hot Wheels cars obviously. They mention stunts being easy to pull off just by twirling the analog stick, which sounds about right for the time, you know, keep it simple. Graphically, they say it's colourful, but not massively detailed, which, again, sounds like most N64 races. Sounds get a lukewarm it has some. Mastery is fast but doesn't push the console too hard, and lifespan is a bit short even with 2 players. Verdicts are 61%, calling it competent but ultimately tiresome. A bit harsh maybe, but then again, there were a lot of racing games back then. Then there's Army Men, Sarge's Heroes, a 3DO game. It's a third-person shooter based on the PC strategy game, playing as toy soldiers. They say it's got a Micro Machines and GoldenEye vibe, which is interesting, mixing toy soldiers with those games. Plenty of weapons from rifles to flamethrowers, all that army stuff. They note the controls are a bit imprecise, and the graphics are foggy and basic, but say the soldiers are nice and plasticky, which is a funny way of putting it. Sounds are tinny marching tunes, fitting I suppose. Mastery is there, but not done very well. And 4-player is good for lifespan. Verdicts are 67%, saying the premise is wasted by substandard execution, which sounds like a polite way of saying it's a bit of a letdown. Shame really, Army Men was quite a thing back then in the toy world. This page is a review of Road Rash 64 from back in the day. Right, Road Rash on the N64, yeah I remember this. The reviewer seems to think it's alright, not amazing but alright. They call it ultimately good rather than great, which is, well, damning with faint praise really. They've given it a 69%, cheeky arcade. Looking at the pluses, they say it's fast, got good handling and plenty of multiplayer options, which is decent. But the minuses are ugly, basic, and not exactly riveting. Ouch. They reckon the graphics are exactly polished to perfection, with sarcasm I assume, given the minus points. At least the shoddy graphics help keep the speed up. That's a classic line, isn't it? Making a virtue out of a necessity. It says if you like this, then you might like Vigilante 8 on the N64 as well. Made by Activision, they gave that a 74%. Apparently it's more wheeled combat but with cars and guns. Yeah, I remember Vigilante 8, that was alright actually. Warrentiskever. They've got sections on visuals, sounds, mastery and lifespan, giving them all a score of 5 or 6 out of 10. Visually, it's foggy, basic and fuzzy. Very first generation, which is a bit rough. Sounds are fitting effects, and a RAAAAWK soundtrack. Mastery is graphically a bit 1996 but fast and smooth. Lifespan, the single player is limited but there's multiplayer. Sounds like a bit of a mixed bag then. Rough. Fun for 4 section talks about the 4-player mode, saying it won't replace Mario Kart or F-Zero but it's accomplished and enjoyable. They mention Ped Hunt mode, which is mowing down pedestrians. Unsavory they call it. And they mention Carmageddon as well. Yeah, that was a bit controversial at the time, wasn't it? Info burst table says it's from THQ, 96 megabit cart size, 1 to 4 players, controller pack is 1 page, cartridge save, no password save, no expansion pack, no rumble pack, no GB pack. When's it out? Now in the US and UK, TBA for Japan, and cost is £40. £40! Games were pricey back then, weren't they? They mention Excitebike 64, Top Gear Hyperbike, and Jeremy McGrath Supercross being on the horizon, saying maybe best to save your money and wait. Bit harsh but fair enough. Overall, sounds like Road Rash 64 is a bit average. Good for a quick blast with mates maybe, but nothing special. Probably the best Road Rash ever, but, as a game it was never that fantastic anyway. Sums it up really, doesn't it? This page is a review of Destruction Derby 64 for the N64, harking back to the PlayStation original. Seems a bit late to the party, doesn't it? 3 years late, they reckon. The reviewer, Tim Weaver, calls it old, basic, and got crashes. Fair enough, that's the whole point of Destruction Derby in it. They say it's still alright entertainment in 1999, even if it is a bit derivative, with its cardboard boxcars and rapidly grating commentary. The info burst box tells us it's from THQ, a 64 megabit card, 1 to 4 players, uses a controller pack, but no cartridge save, password save, expansion pack or GB pack, and it's out now, costing £40. Seems a bit steep for an old game re-released, even in 1999 money. They talk about the Bomb Deal multiplayer mode, which sounds a bit like Capture the Flag with explosions, and Deathmatch, and a bomb tag mode. Apparently, it's good fun with mates. The review scores it 65%, with pluses and minuses. Pluses are oddly compelling crash-based mayhem, bowl levels, and some good multiplayer options. Minuses are technical problems aplenty, short-lived one-player game, and becomes boring. Pretty balanced then. They compare it to Vigilante 8 on the N64 and Activision, giving that a higher score of 74%. They also mention Driver as a game it falls between, but doesn't do as well as either. Visuals get a 7, sounds get a 6, mastery gets a 6, and lifespan gets a 5. Verdict is, it's 3 years out of date, and it shows, but there is some fun to be had. Basically, it's alright for a bit, but nothing special. Pretty standard N64 fare I suppose. Got a few screenshots dotted about showing cars crashing, as you'd expect. Looks a bit blocky, even for the time, but hey, it's all about the crashes, isn't it? This page in N64 Magazine seems to be having a look at Gauntlet Legends. Proper old-school arcade fun updated for the N64. They're calling it an admirable update of a golden oldie classic, which is fair enough. The page is split into sections like pluses and minuses, which is very straightforward. The plus points are decent visuals for the N64, fast action, and good times in 4-player mode. Minuses are that it can get boring on your own and it's a bit repetitive, and let's be honest, it is very similar to the game from 15 years prior, which they are calling a minus. I suppose that's both a good and bad thing, really. It mentions if you like Mario Party you might like this because it's all about multiplayer fun, which is probably a decent comparison for the time. Jabariya. They've broken down the review into sections with icons and scores out of 10, for visuals, sounds, mastery and lifespan each getting a 7, except for lifespan which gets another 7-bit repetitive scoring there. The sounds section even quotes the classic "Warrior is nearly dead" voice sample, which takes you back. Mastery talks about stacks of monsters and non-stop action, and a bit of slowdown in multiplayer, which was fairly common in those days. There's an info burst box that's got all the techie details: cartridge size, 128 megabit, 1 to 4 players, controller and rumble pack compatibility. Standard stuff for an N64 game. Top of the classes section talks about the 4 character classes: Warrior, Wizard, Valkyrie and Archer, saying they're all different and it's best to have one of each in multiplayer. Apparently, there are secret characters to unlock too. They also show screenshots of the character select screens with stats like strength, speed, magic and armor for each class. Warrior seems like the tank, Wizard for magic, Valkyrie in between and Archer for speed maybe? The game apparently has a hub system where the Wizard lives, according to one of the text boxes by a screenshot. Other screenshot boxes point out things like gates needing switches and wizards having devastating magic, classic Gauntlet stuff. Another points out you have to destroy generators to stop monsters spawning, which sounds about right. Orienting. The verdict is positive, saying grab some mates and controllers for an old school romp, and they've given it 81%. Not bad at all. Seems like they thought it was a decent multiplayer blast, but maybe a bit samey if you're playing on your own, which sounds like a pretty accurate summary of Gauntlet. This page features a review of Gex, Deep Cover Gecko, on the N64. It's titled Let's Twitch Again, which is probably a nod to the first Gex game, which I vaguely remember getting a so-so review in this very mag back in issue 21. They only gave it 59% if you can believe it. The reviewer is not pulling any punches, calling Gex a hideous rogue abomination and saying it's a real mess from start to finish. They're complaining about the jerky animation, frame rate drops, and general headache-inducing visuals. Apparently, it's so bad it's almost unwatchably jerky and guaranteed to give you brain hurt. Ouch. The screenshots they've included don't look too bad, but they're probably just the least offensive ones they could find. One caption mentions a friendly green creature, and another says the scenery in Gex's house isn't much to look at really, which is putting it mildly. There's a little info burst box detailing the game. It's on a 256 megabits cart, which was quite big at the time, I suppose. 1 player only, rumble pack compatible but no expansion pack or Game Boy pack support, and cartridge save is a big cross passwords only then I guess. It was out in December, same month as the mag, and cost a hefty £40. Blimey. The pluses and minuses section is brutally honest. The only plus is that the cartridge is made of sturdy plastic, good for propping up wobbly table legs, apparently hardly a selling point for a video game, is it? The minuses are a proper list of complaints. It's ugly, it's dull, it'll give you a headache, and you'll cry if you waste £40 on it. Cheery stuff. The "if you like this" section is a bit sarcastic. It says Gex, enter the Gecko GT, that's the first one they reviewed and slated, remember? Go, and says, you're probably some kind of masochist if you liked it. Charming. Go. The scoring breakdown is equally harsh. Visuals get 2 out of 5, sounds a measly 1, mastery a 1, lifespan a 2, and the overall verdict is a dismal 22%. They've really gone to town on this one. The reviewer sums it up by saying, someone at Crave, the publisher, must have really upset them to warrant bringing this travesty to the N64. Brutal. Looks like Gex, Deep Cover Gecko is one to avoid then, even at Christmas time in '99. This page is an import arena review for Bakuretsu Muteki Bangayo on the N64, looks like a right Japanese blaster. Developed by Treasure, who did Mischief Makers, so you know it's going to be a bit different. It's described as a turbocharged SNES shooter, which at the time was a bit of a retro vibe for the N64, but SNES shooters were proper good fun. The review reckons it's boss-tastic and fast-paced, proper mental with loads of sprites on screen, which they say is the busiest they've ever seen. Sounds hectic. They're saying it's fantastic fun, and the levels need different tactics, so not just a mindless blast, which is good. Downsides are it might not impress your mates, looks a bit old school maybe, and could get boring if you aren't a fan of 80s arcade games. Bit harsh on the 80s arcade games, mind? Accessibility-wise, seems okay as long as you don't accidentally delete your save data, which they apparently did. Oops. Graphically they say it's plain retro backgrounds, but loads going on, which is fair enough for this kind of game. Sounds get a 7, visuals a 7, with 6 for mastery, and 8 for lifespan, so plenty to keep you going. They reckon it's a brilliant high score challenge, so right up my street back then, trying to get on the leaderboards at school. They mention if you liked Desaimon 3D you'll like this, so another slightly obscure but good Japanese shooter. They give it 84% in the verdict, saying it's frantic, effortlessly playable, and old school shoot 'em up fun. Martin Kitts, the reviewer, wants a PAL release, says we'll buy it. Bit keen there, Martin. There's a little info box saying it's 96 megabit, 1 player, controller pack save, rumble pack compatible, and costing 5,800 yen, which they reckon is about £70 on import. Blimey, imports were pricey back then, weren't they? Still, sounds like it might have been worth a punt if you were into your shooters. This page of the magazine writes all about Club 64, remember that? Bit of a hub for N64 owners in the mag, wasn't it? Looks like this month they are banging on about Jet Force Gemini. Yep, Jet Force Gemini is their top guide. Big deal, lip-quivering massive guide they reckon. Lots of screenshots from it, looking very colourful for the time I suppose. Then you've got your usual bits and bobs for Club 64. Mailbox, page 90, for your burning questions, answered no doubt with the usual level of insightful wit. How to, on page 94, getting everything in Jet Force Gemini, bet that's useful for finding all those tribals. Tips extra on page 98, for all the latest tips for your fave N64 games as they say. Oh, and Dr. Kit's Game Clinic on page 103, always a laugh. Apparently he's curing gaming ulcers this month. Useful, they say with a straight face. Then, I'm the best, on page 104, new leagues to test your mettle, and Skill Club 64, going stronger than ever apparently, asking if you're good enough for platinum on page 108. The directory is there too, on page 112, every N64 game reviewed, sweet they say, always so enthusiastic. And finally, back issues and subscriptions on page 122, to keep the coffers full I imagine. Oh, and a little N64 logo at the bottom saying it's issue 89, Christmas 1999. Can you believe it? Christmas 1999 feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago at the same time. This page from Club 64 in N64 Magazine is the mailbox section, where readers get to have their say, bless 'em. Right at the top is the star letter, from a chap called Dan in Bristol, moaning about Pokemon on the old Game Boy when everyone's got a colour Game Boy. Bit harsh, but Ed, the editor, calmly explains Pokemon was designed for the original Game Boy, fair enough, and that Red and Blue are still cracking games. Good point, well made, they were massive at the time. Warrington Main Boy, fair. Next up, someone spotted a cheeky rip-off in a PlayStation game called Climax Landers. Apparently there's a character suspiciously like Link, our Zelda hero, complete with pointy ears and green tunic. Ed has a bit of a laugh about it, calling it a nasty cowlick and pointing out the similarities. You wouldn't get away with that these days, would you? Then there's a worried reader complaining about the 4 megabytes expansion pack. He's saying games like Shadow Man aren't really showing off the benefit and are still a bit jerky and slow. Ed agrees there's been a lot of letters about it, and that people are concerned. He reckons it's more for overall performance rather than just better graphics, mentioning upcoming games like Donkey Kong, Perfect Dark, and Zelda Gaiden, which should make better use of it. We were all hoping for amazing things from that expansion pack back then, weren't we? Lastly, the correction corner, where they eat humble pie for any mistakes. Looks like they messed up the score for A Bug's Life and spelled someone's name wrong twice. And there's some confusion about game guide tips. Always good to see them owning up to errors. Keeps them honest, I suppose. All in all, typical reader's letters page really. Bit of Pokemon chat, a moan about the expansion pack, and spelling mistakes. Classic magazine fodder. This page is a typical letters page from the mag back in the day, remember these? Loads of readers writing in about stuff. One bloke, called Edward Barnes, was surprised someone in a game didn't die, fair enough I suppose. Someone else is sending in their baby brother's CV, bit cheeky. There's a bit of a debate about bonus letters themselves. A Chifeng Nam is asking what's the point of them, and Ed, the editor, is being all cryptic as usual. David Byrne reckons they're very good, which is a bit much, Dave, calm down. Then there's a section called Their Stuff, which is about someone who thinks Lara Croft is popular with Nintendo fans, and the editor's saying it's a change from computer games. Hugh Lindley wrote that bit. Following on from that, Overpriced is moaning about Nintendo Player's Choice games being a bit pricey at £30, even for older games like GoldenEye and Mario Kart, which were still brilliant at the time. Tony Wellham from Cardiff wrote that in. Warrington Nulkus. Matt from Christchurch is moaning about the delay of World Driver Championship. Remember that game? He went to every town with electricity to find it, because of a review in issue 32, only to find out it was delayed until November 5th. Poor sod. Ed's reply is all rag-a-tip and that, whatever that means. Lastly, there's a So Tell Me This Q&A section. Someone's asking about Harvest Moon 2 on the N64, and they reckon it's coming early next year. Another question is about Psygnosis ODT, and if Psygnosis are still doing anything on the N64. Apparently it's being developed in France now, we'll see about that. Someone else is asking about Syndicate or Bobcat, and the answer is just none whatsoever. Bit harsh. Then there are questions about Zelda Gaiden, if Zelda and Ganondorf will be in it, and how it'll be better than Ocarina of Time. They reckon all the characters from Ocarina will be in Gaiden, but in a slightly different guise, and that it's more of a companion piece. Finally, someone called David Kelly is asking, where's Metroid then? Which is what we were all wondering at the time. No real answer for that one, just no news still. And then Gary Watton from Plymouth wants to know why Perfect Dark is delayed until April, and apparently Rare told them it's because they are implementing revolutionary new features that no one else has even considered. Which is a bit of a hype if you ask me. They suspect it's to do with the multiplayer mode. We'll see about that too. This page in N64 Magazine issue 36 dives straight into Jet Force Gemini, remember that one? Big deal at the time, Rare were on a roll, weren't they? Anyway, this is a how-to guide for filling your pockets in it, meaning grabbing all the collectibles, specifically in Mizar's Palace. Apparently you could spend ages trying to find everything, so this is meant to help you out. Wah! There's a bit called What We Said, from a previous issue, issue 34, where they reviewed Jet Force Gemini and gave it a massive 93% score. Blimey! They were proper impressed, saying it was so fun you'd want to thank Rare for still caring about gameplay. A bit strong maybe, but it was a decent game, to be fair. Walkthroughs. Then there's a breakdown of where to find tribals in Mizar's Palace, split into lobby, flume and chasm areas. Looks like a list of locations like corner of leftmost lobby room and room after water maze exit. Handy if you were stuck, I suppose, before the internet made all this stuff instantly available. There's a picture of one of those tribals looking a bit worried at the bottom too, bless him. Yeah, Jet Force Gemini, pretty standard Rare fare, but it kept us busy back then. The next page of Club 64 is all about Jet Force Gemini. Blimey, I remember that one. It's giving us the lowdown on where to find all those tribals. You know, those little fellas you had to rescue, and bits and bobs like totems and ship parts scattered around various levels. So for Goldwood, they're telling you about Vela's route and Lupus's route to get through. Apparently if you're playing as Vela, hug the right wall near King Jeff's house for a secret area with fish and a totem, and if you want a multiplayer bonus for Floyd's mission, go for a gold medal, right you are. Lupus's route is through a submerged tunnel and then shooting a treetop sniper to open a life force door to get to the gem quarry and a shocker weapon. Sounds about right. Spaceship level, spin around and drop to the right as you leave the ship to find a flamethrower. Beauty, they say, bit much in it, and there's a totem in a 2-floored room with a jetpad. Handy, bit pally. Gem quarry is about shooting gems into a generator to fix the planet's orbit, and Jeff gives you a ship part. Cheers, Jeff. SS Anubis level, blast the glass in the conveyor belt room, follow the doors and crawl into a small hole for earplugs. Crikey. A totem is in the corner of the crisscross walkway room. Near Anubis's entrance, climb the crates for the peak walkway exit. And if you're struggling with the 7 computer panels, they've listed their locations: moving lift, 6 columns room, crisscross walkway corner, conveyor belt room, and the prison room itself. Very helpful, cheers mag. Then there's a whole section dedicated to finding tribals, broken down by level: outset, interior, lodge, abandoned wreck, rim, landing and hold, plus depository and passageway. They're giving specific locations like First Forest Corridor, inside First Village Huts, near Yellow Keybox in Cave for outset, and so on for all the levels. Blimey, they've really gone to town. Must have been a right pain to find them all back in the day without these tips, eh? Good on them for pointing out where they all are, save a bit of time. Always useful in Jet Force Gemini. That game was a bit of a completionist's nightmare sometimes, wasn't it? This page from N64 Magazine's How To Club 64 right takes me back. Remember needing these for game tips before the internet was glued to your phone? It's all about Jet Force Gemini, that Rare shooter. Looks like it's a guide to finding all the hidden bits, totems and ship parts across various levels. It covers Peak Walkway, Torfret, Spawn Ship, and Rith Essa. Then there's a section on tribals, breaking that level down into a few areas like Bog, Bridge, Castle, and Troop Carrier, and then Bluff, Ascent, Interior and Mine. Loads of tribals areas listed there it seems. They've got specific routes for Vela, Juno and Lupus. On some levels, they're mentioning using jetpads and shockers, and even doing things like giving a magazine to a character called Gimlet to open up the mine. Yeah, Jet Force Gemini, classic rare weirdness. Probably made sense when you were actually knee-deep in it, didn't it? This page is all about getting the most out of Jet Force Gemini, remember that one? Rare at their peak, weren't they? It's a how-to guide from Club 64, trying to help you fill your pockets with goodies in the game. It kicks off with Eshabone, telling you to float across to the Magenta Key door and then get gold in a Floyd mission for a bonus, and also to walk through the glowing ribs in the thorax area, blow open a wooden door, use the jetpad into a tunnel, and find a ship part at the end on a giant brain pleasant. Then it's Sekhmet, where the magenta door that originally led to Fishface now has a totem and a ship part. Access to Water Ruin is from Sekhmet too, apparently. Lupus's route is mentioned for a totem on the spiral walkway, using Lupus to jet over to it. Water Ruin section says to swim to the castle ruin to find timed mines, which can be used as proximity mines, handy for those tribals. There's also a hint to give a bear the earplugs found at SS Anubis to get a ship part, bit of a weird side quest that Tatai. Cerulean is next, and apparently you shouldn't have much trouble finding the totem in the room after the ice field. Dune levels tribal locations are mentioned, in the room after the ice field, and behind the ship at the end. Ichor section mentions Juno's route with a totem in the high tunnel, with snipers and a jetpad. For any route, you can break glass in the first indoor room for a Floyd mission and an arcade chip if you get gold. Juno/Vela's route involves the blue door, sniping bugs outside, and using the arcade chip in the Big Bug Fun Club to beat arcade games for 2 bonuses. Lupus' route has a ship part in the floating platforms and jetpad room. Then there are tribal locations listed for various levels like Thorax, Approach, Battlecruiser, Cortex, Lost Island, Dune, Military Base and Perimeter. It's a load of tribals to collect, scattered all over the place in each level, from first rooms to underwater tunnels, maze walkways, and sniper rooms. They really wanted you to explore every nook and cranny, didn't they? Good times though, classic rare collectathon. This page of N64 Magazine, back from '99 it must be, is all about cheat codes and tips, proper old school stuff. Right at the top it's got Duke Nukem. 0 Hour, remember that one? 3D Realms, trying to keep Duke relevant in the late 90s. There's a load of cheat codes for it, like unlocking everything, getting all weapons and ammo, infinite lives, the usual suspects. They've even got a code to get massive weapons, and another to make the graphics look rubbish I suppose if you really wanted to punish your eyes. They're also on about finding secrets to unlock stuff like Ice Skin, which sounds a bit weird, and high-speed zombies in Drytown, which sounds like a right laugh, doesn't it? They've even got a maximum blaster ammo cheat, for when you really want to go over the top. Then there's a bit on Tonic Trouble, that platformer, with the weird scientist bloke. It's talking about extra moves. Bit convoluted to pull off by the looks of it, pressing all sorts of buttons and directions. Lastly, there's a tiny section on Hybrid Heaven, that wrestling RPG thing. Apparently you can play as an alien, or even as President Weller, whoever he is. Sounds a bit daft to be honest. Anyway, that's the gist of it, cheat codes and tips for your N64 games, just like we used to get back in the day. This page is all about tips and tricks for a few games, proper retro stuff. At the top, it's hyping up some tips as extra special, reckon they were trying to fill the page out. First up is Command & Conquer, that classic PC strategy game they ported to the N64. There's some tips for cheats, like building quickly by holding buttons down, standard stuff really for console ports of PC games back then. They mention getting Orca helicopters by nicking tech from the enemy, which was a neat trick if you could pull it off. And of course everyone wanted gold weapons because gold is always better, in it. There's also a weird X-Files moment tip about seeing a UFO if you bomb a specific spot on level 6. Sounds like a load of rubbish, but we'd probably have tried it back in the day, just in case. Oh, and something about stealing harvesters, classic CNC cheeky tactics. Cashew. Then it's Revolt, remember that? Little radio-controlled cars racing around. They've got cheat codes for unlocking all cars and tracks, using a button combo which is always handy, and tips about reverse tracks and mirror tracks, you know, to squeeze every last bit of gameplay out of it. Lastly, there's a classic tip for 1080 degrees snowboarding, the snowboarding game. Quick start tip, trick tips in the half pipe, and something about watching your ghost, probably to improve your skills. Seems like standard tips for a snowboarding game, nothing too groundbreaking but useful enough if you were stuck, I guess. Good bit of Christmas gaming fodder for 99. This page of N64 Magazine is showing us the reader's top 15 tips. Always a good read to see what sneaky things people have discovered. Number 1 is for WWF Attitude, a wrestling game, suggesting you make a weak custom wrestler and beat them up to practice your moves, which sounds a bit brutal really. Tamsiwa. Then there's a Zelda, Ocarina of Time tip about a diving game in Zora's Domain. Seems you can cheat the timer by jumping in a certain way, typical Zelda puzzle box thinking. Premier Manager 64 has a dodgy trick for the transfer market involving red cards. Sounds like exploiting the game a bit. Gaitin me. Quake 2 is in there, with a low gravity cheat using some code. For multiplayer maps, imagine the chaos with that. GoldenEye 007, of course, has a tip headshots for more ammo. Obvious really, but worth stating, especially on the complex level. Another Zelda tip, this time for the Ganondorf battle. Deflecting fireballs using a spin attack, that's a proper gamer move. FIFA 99 is next, with a corner kick tactic, passing it along the ground. Sounds a bit dull but probably effective. WWF Attitude appears again, with a tip for knocking weapons out of opponents' hands, and another WWF Warzone tip about throwing people out of the ring and teleporting back in. Sounds glitchy but fun. Buster Move 3DX has a tip about continuing in arcade mode without using continues, so basically cheating for free continues. Who wouldn't want that back in the day? Boring. GoldenEye crops up again, with a funny one. Using the all guns cheat and then going to the statue level, you can apparently snipe at Valentin dancing near a helicopter. Sounds more like messing around than a proper tip. WWF Warzone again, just telling you to pummel your opponent until their energy bar is red. Basic stuff really. Cora. WWF Attitude makes its final appearance, with a tip about changing the language to teen, for different music and speech in the game. A bit of a weird one but maybe amusing. And lastly, GoldenEye gets another mention for enabling invincibility and slow animation on the facility level. Then killing Auramov and watching Trevelyan shoot soldiers, bit of a specific cheat scenario there. Below all that is a form for sending in your own top tips, asking for the game name, what the tip does, and the code itself, plus your details of course. Standard stuff for these mags back then, always trying to get reader input. This page is from Dr. Kit's Game Clinic in N64 Magazine, looks like. He's back with his usual scary syringe and bad jokes. We've got gamers writing in with their problems as per usual, bless 'em. First up, Lisa from Cardiff is stuck in Banjo-Kazooie, early doors by the sounds of it. Captain Blubber's treasure is causing her grief. Dr. Kits is pretty smug about this one, tells her it's easy peasy, under the ship and by the side of the ship, helpful as ever. Then there's David from Ayrshire, moaning about the train level in GoldenEye on Zero Agent. Natalia always gets herself killed. Yeah, we've all been there, mate. Dr. Kits just says to give Natalia extra seconds. Cheers, Doc. Groundbreaking advice. Adam from Earth apparently is having trouble with body harvest and some alien artifacts, but doesn't seem to know what he's even meant to be doing. Dr. Kits is properly taking the mick out of him, calling a mate in Scotland for help, and going on about destructive weapons. Sounds like typical body harvest chaos. Eric from Northants is lost in Zelda, trying to find Naryu's love spell. Can't find who sells masks. Dr. Kits is being a bit of a know-it-all again, reeling off a list of mask sellers. Keaton's skull scary bunny mask. Cheers for the spoilers, Doc. Says Bomber Crack in the Desert Colossus for the spell. Helpful I suppose if you haven't worked it out yet. Finally, Niam from Belfast is stuck in Diddy Kong Racing, Sherbet Island. Can't find a key. Dr. Kits is in a rush to finish up, but says it's in Crescent Island in a small alcove in the ocean. Done and done, he says. Right then. Orrington Norcroot. And at the bottom, there's the usual got a gaming query box if you want to write in with your own gaming problems. Good old Dr. Kits, always there to help in his own special way. The next page is all about proving you're the best gamer, isn't it? They're asking for folks to send in their top scores for a few games. It seems Mario Golf was the flavor of the month. They're raving about it and saying it should be big, and they wanted readers to send in their best golf scores for their I'm the Best League. Someone named Edward Melek from London even got a fancy new joypad for sending in proof of a hole known in Mario Golf. Classy stuff. Then there's new high score, talking about World Driver Championship. Apparently the release date slipped, like they always did back then, and they had to delay their planned competition. But it was finally out, and they'd awarded a joypad to Chris Adams for his wipeout 64 times instead. Always shifting things around. Pep. There's a bit called This Month's Time to Beat, for Jet Force Gemini, which they reckoned was going to be a proper blaster. They wanted people to try and beat 27 seconds on Jeff and Barry's arcade racing in that. Good luck with that. The rest of the page is just tables of top Wipeout 64 and Quake 2 times sent in by readers. For Wipeout 64, they have tracks like Clyde's Bridge and Dyroness, with names like Chris Adams and Rob Van Der Koo topping the leaderboards. And then for Quake 2, there are levels like Strog Outpost and Orbital Defense, with times from a David Park and an Andrew Mills. It's all pretty standard fare for these mags, showing off reader scores and trying to get everyone involved, you know? This page is an advert for the next issue of N64 Magazine, issue 36. It's hyping up the year 2000 as being massive for Nintendo, which, looking back, it kind of was actually. They're promising brand new shots for games you simply must have come the next millennium. Bit dramatic, lads, but alright. It's got a section labelled Including in a cartoon speech bubble, very 90s that, and it's showing off some upcoming games with screenshots. We've got Perfect Dark, which was Rare's follow-up to GoldenEye, and was a huge deal at the time. Everyone was desperate to see if it could live up to the hype. There's a shot from the Riga level, looks pretty moody. Then there's Zelda Gaiden, which I guess they are calling Majora's Mask here. It's got that very distinctive clock tower image. Looked a bit weirder than Ocarina of Time, that's for sure. Kimi. Next up is Pokemon Stadium, showing a Psyduck, must have been a new one for the N64. Then a game called Super Mario Adventure, which I don't actually recall. Hang on. Oh, it's Super Mario 64. Adventure must be some kind of subtitle they added, with a picture of Mario in what looks like the Peach's Castle courtyard. Bit odd to still be showing off Mario 64 in '99. But it was always a classic, I suppose. Peaceola. Underneath that, there's Rika, again for Perfect Dark. Bit repetitive. Then Pokemon Snap, with Todd sniping away in his buggy. Eternal Darkness is there too, which was that horror game from Silicon Knights. Looked properly dark and spooky. Definitely different from the usual Nintendo fare. Finally, they've got Pokemon Yellow, with a picture of a Doduo battling an Ekans, so they're clearly covering the Game Boy Pokemon games too. Overall, it's a pretty standard coming soon page, trying to get you excited for the next issue. Lots of big names there, particularly if you were into Nintendo games. Pokemon and Zelda always sell issues. This page of the magazine, it's the cover no doubt, screams late 90s N64 mania, doesn't it? Right at the top it's shouting about Donkey Kong 64, telling you how to grab the first 50 golden bananas. Good luck with that, eh? Always needed a guide for those collectathons. Then there's a section for even more pics, showing off a few upcoming games. Mother 3, which we never actually got over here on the N64 in the end. Interesting to see it mentioned back then. ISS Millennium, another footy game. Must have been loads of those around at the time. And Castlevania, Legacy of Darkness. Always liked a bit of Castlevania, even if it wasn't quite Symphony of the Night, was it? Below that, Reviewed. Highlights a few racing games. Top Gear Rally 2, South Park Rally Kart Racers were all the rage, weren't they? And Top Gear Hyperbike. Wonder if they were any good. Probably middling, to be honest. Not everything could be Mario Kart. Down the right hand side, they're listing what's inside first news on new games, tips and cheats, Japanese and US game reviews, challenges and prizes. You know, the usual magazine fodder, claiming to be the only reviews you can trust. Bit cheeky that, weren't they all? And of course, there's the big, absolutely free thing at the bottom, hyping up some mystery free gift for the next issue. Bigger and better than ever. They always said that, didn't they? Probably a sticker or something, but back then, you'd lap it up. This issue was out on Monday the 20th of December, just in time for Christmas '99 then. Classic N64 magazine stuff. This page in N64 Magazine takes me right back. It's got one of their Wish You Were Here articles, this time about Body Harvest. Remember that one? Always looked a bit ropey graphically, even back then, like a blurry mess on the telly. Apparently, according to Jess Bickham, they sketched it out on a napkin, which figures. He reckons it's a bit like a simple shoot 'em up, mowing down insectoid invaders, but with some RPG bits and puzzles thrown in. He goes on about driving vehicles and blowing up alien bugs, saying it's moody, atmospheric and cinematic, which is a bit much, even for 1999. Sounds like he quite liked it though, calls it a video game equivalent of boiled cabbage, but then says it's an absolute storm. Bit mixed messages there, Jess mate. Over on the side there's the index for issue 36, looks like the usual mix. Loads of previews and reviews. Army Men, Bangayo, Carmageddon 64, Donkey Kong 64, Gauntlet Legends, Resident Evil 2, Road Rash 64, South Park Rally, Super Smash Bros. All the big hitters of the time are in there somewhere. They've even got a Zelda Gaiden preview, which must have been Majora's Mask before they called it that over here. Good times. Next issue is out just before Christmas in December, so that's something to look forward to.